አድማጮቻችን እንኳን ደህና ቆያችሁን። በአሁኑ ጊዜ ደግሞ የካርል ቮንን ሁለተኛውን ቮሊዩም 2 ማሰማት እንጀምራለን ማለት ነው። መልካም ቆይታ። ኦኬ፣ ዝግጅታችን ይጀምራል።
That which in the student's chamber may appear only the ordinary standard. Danger in war belongs to its friction. A correct idea of its influence is necessary for truth of perception, and therefore it is brought under notice here. Chapter 5 of Bodily Exertion in War. If no one were allowed to pass an opinion on the events of war, except at a moment when he is benumbed by frost, sinking from heat and thirst, or dying with hunger and fatigue, we should certainly have fewer judgments correct objectively, but they would be so subjectively, at least, that is, they would contain in themselves the exact relation between the person giving the judgment and the object. We can perceive this by observing how modestly subdued, even spiritless and desponding, is the opinion passed upon the results of untoward events by those who have been eyewitnesses, but especially if they have been parties concerned. This is, according to our view, a criterion of the influence which bodily fatigue exercises, and of the allowance to be made for it in matters of opinion. Amongst the many things in war for which no tariff can be fixed, bodily effort may be specially reckoned. Provided there is no waste, it is a coefficient of all the forces, and no one can tell exactly to what extent it may be carried. But what is remarkable is that just as only a strong arm enables the archer to stretch the bowstring to the utmost extent, so also in war it is only by means of a great directing spirit that we can expect the full power latent in the troops to be developed. For it is one thing if an army, in consequence of great misfortunes, surrounded with danger, falls all to pieces like a wall that has been thrown down, and can only find safety in the utmost exertion of its bodily strength. It is another thing entirely when a victorious army, drawn on by proud feelings only, is conducted at the will of its chief. The same effort which in one case might at most excite our pity must in the other call forth our admiration, because it is much more difficult to sustain. By this comes to light for the inexperienced eye one of those things which put fetters in the dark, as it were, on the action of the mind, and wear out in secret the powers of the soul. Although here the question is strictly only respecting the supreme effort required by a commander from his army, by a leader from his followers, therefore of the spirit to demand it, and of the art of getting it, still the personal physical exertion of generals and of the chief commander must not be overlooked. Having brought the analysis of war conscientiously up to this point, we could not but take account also of the weight of this small remaining residue. We have spoken here of bodily effort, chiefly because, like danger, it belongs to the fundamental causes of friction, and because its indefinite quantity makes it like an elastic body, the friction of which is well known to be difficult to calculate. To check the abuse of these considerations, of such a survey of things which might aggravate the difficulties of war, nature has given our judgment a guide in our sensibilities, just as an individual cannot with advantage refer to his personal deficiencies if he is insulted and ill-treated, but may well do so if he has successfully repelled the affront or fully revenged it, so no commander or army will lessen the impression of a disgraceful defeat by depicting the danger, the distress, the exertions, things which would immensely enhance the glory of a victory. Thus our feeling, which, after all, is only a higher kind of judgment, forbids us to do what seems an act of justice to which our judgment would be inclined. Chapter 6. Information in War. By the word information, we denote all the knowledge which we have of the enemy and his country, therefore, in fact, the foundation of all our ideas and actions. Let us consider the nature of this foundation, its want of trustworthiness, its changefulness, and we shall soon feel what a dangerous edifice war is, how easily it may fall to pieces and bury us in its ruins. For although it is a maxim in all books that we should trust only certain information, that we must always be suspicious, that is only a miserable book comfort, belonging to that description of knowledge in which writers of systems and compendiums take refuge for want of anything better to say. Great part of the information obtained in war is contradictory, a still greater part is false, and by far the greatest part is of a doubtful character. What is required of an officer is a certain power of discrimination, which only knowledge of men and things and good judgment can give. The law of probability must be his guide. This is not a trifling difficulty, even in respect of the first plans, which can be formed in the chamber outside the real sphere of war, but it is enormously increased when in the thick of war itself one report follows hard upon the heels of another. It is then fortunate if these reports, in contradicting each other, show a certain balance of probability, and thus call forth a scrutiny. It is much worse for the inexperienced when accident does not render him this service, but one report supports another, confirms it, magnifies it, finishes off the picture with fresh touches of colour, until necessity in urgent haste forces from us a resolution which will soon be discovered to be folly, all those results having been lies, exaggerations, errors, and such and such. In a few words, most reports are false, and the timidity of men acts as a multiplier of lies and untruths. As a general rule, everyone is more inclined to lend credence to the bad than the good. Everyone is inclined to magnify the bad in some measure, and although the alarms which are thus propagated like the waves of the sea subside into themselves, still, like them, without any apparent cause, they rise again. Firm in reliance on his own better convictions, the chief must stand like a rock against which the sea breaks its fury in vain. The role is not easy. He who is not by nature of a buoyant disposition, or trained by experience in war and matured in judgment, may let it be his rule to do violence to his own natural conviction, by inclining from the side of fear to that of hope. Only by that means will he be able to preserve his balance. This difficulty of seeing things correctly, which is one of the greatest sources of friction in war, makes things appear quite different from what was expected. The impression of the senses is stronger than the force of the ideas resulting from methodical reflection, and this goes so far that no important undertaking was ever yet carried out without the commander having to subdue new doubts in himself at the time of commencing the execution of his work. Ordinary men who follow the suggestions of others become, therefore, undecided on the spot. They think that they have found circumstances different from what they had expected, and this view gains strength by their, again, yielding to the suggestions of others. But even the man who has made his own plans, when he comes to see things with his own eyes, will often think he has done wrong. Firm reliance on self must make him proof against the seeming pressure of the moment. His first conviction will, in the end, prove true, when the foreground scenery, which fate has pushed onto the stage of war, with its accompaniments of terrific objects, is drawn aside and the horizon extended. This is one of the great chasms which separate conception from execution. Chapter 7. Friction in War. As long as we have no personal knowledge of war, we cannot conceive where those difficulties lie of which so much is said, and what that genius and those extraordinary mental powers required in a general have really to do. All appears so simple, all the requisite branches of knowledge appear so plain, all the combinations so unimportant, that in comparison with them, the easiest problem in higher mathematics impresses us with a certain scientific dignity. But if we have seen war, all becomes intelligible, and still, after all, it is extremely difficult to describe what it is which brings about this change, to specify this invisible and completely efficient factor. Everything is very simple in war, but the simplest thing is difficult. These difficulties accumulate and produce a friction which no man can imagine exactly who has not seen war. Suppose now a traveller, who towards evening expects to accomplish the 2 stages at the end of a day's journey, 4 or 5 leagues with post horses on the high road it is nothing. He arrives now at the last station but one, finds no horses or very bad ones. Then a hilly country, bad roads, it is a dark night, and he is glad when, after a great deal of trouble, he reaches the next station, and finds there some miserable accommodation. So, in war, through the influence of an infinity of petty circumstances which cannot properly be described on paper, things disappoint us, and we fall short of the mark. A powerful iron will overcome this friction, it crushes the obstacles, but certainly the machine along with them. We shall often meet with this result. Like an obelisk toward which the principal streets of a town converge, the strong will of a proud spirit stands prominent and commanding in the middle of the art of war. Friction is the only conception which, in a general way, corresponds to that which distinguishes real war from war on paper. The military machine, the army, and all belonging to it, is in fact simple, and appears on this account easy to manage, but let us reflect that no part of it is in one piece, that it is composed entirely of individuals, each of which keeps up its own friction in all directions. Theoretically, all sounds very well. The commander of a battalion is responsible for the execution of the order given, and as the battalion, by its discipline, is glued together into one piece, and the chief must be a man of acknowledged zeal, the beam turns on an iron pin with little friction. But it is not so in reality, and all that is exaggerated and false in such a conception manifests itself at once in war. The battalion always remains composed of a number of men, of whom, if chance so wills, the most insignificant is able to occasion delay and even irregularity. The danger which war brings with it, the bodily exertions which it requires, augment this evil so much that they may be regarded as the greatest causes of it. This enormous friction, which is not concentrated, as in mechanics at a few points, is therefore everywhere brought into contact with chance, and thus incidents take place upon which it was impossible to calculate, their chief origin being chance. As an instance of one such chance, the weather. Here the fog prevents the enemy from being discovered in time, a battery from firing at the right moment, a report from reaching the general. There, rain prevents a battalion from arriving at the right time, because instead of for 3 it had to march perhaps 8 hours, the cavalry from charging effectively, because it is stuck fast in heavy ground. These are only a few incidents of detail by way of elucidation, that the reader might be able to follow the author, for whole volumes might be written on these difficulties. To avoid this, and still give a clear conception of the host of small difficulties to be contended with in war, we might go on heaping up illustrations, if we were not afraid of being tiresome. But those who have already comprehended us will permit us to add a few more. Activity in war is movement in a resistant medium. Just as a man immersed in water is unable to perform with ease and regularity the most natural and simplest movement, that of walking, so in war, with ordinary powers, one cannot keep even the line of mediocrity. This is the reason that the correct theorist is like a swimming master, who teaches on dry land movements which are required in the water, which must appear grotesque and ludicrous to those who forget about the water. This is also why theorists who have never plunged in themselves, or who cannot deduce any generalities from the experience, are unpractical and even absurd, because they only teach what everyone knows, how to walk. Further, every war is rich in particular facts, while at the same time is an unexplored sea, full of rocks, which the general may have a suspicion of, but which he has never seen with his eye, and round which, moreover, he must steer in the night. If a contrary wind springs up, that is, if any great accidental event declares itself adverse to him, then the most consummate skill, presence of mind, and energy are required, whilst to those who only look on from a distance, all seems to proceed with the utmost ease. The knowledge of this friction is a chief part of that so often talked of, experience in war which is required in a good general. Certainly he is not the best general in whose mind it assumes the greatest dimensions, who is the most overawed by it. This includes that class of over-anxious generals of whom there are so many among the experienced, but a general must be aware of it, that he may overcome it, when that is possible, and that he may not expect a degree of precision in results which is impossible on account of this very friction. Besides, it can never be learnt theoretically, and if it could, there would still be wanting that experience of judgment which is called tact, and which is always more necessary in a field full of innumerable small and diversified objects than in great and decisive cases, when one's own judgment may be aided by consultation with others. Just as the man of the world, through tact of judgment, which has become habit, speaks, acts, and moves only as suits the occasion, so the officer experienced in war will always, in great and small matters, at every pulsation of war, as we may say, decide and determine the suitability to the occasion. Through this experience in practice, the idea comes to his mind of itself that so-and-so will not suit, and thus he will not easily place himself in a position by which he is compromised, which, if it often occurs in war, shakes all the foundations of confidence and becomes extremely dangerous. It is therefore this friction, or what is so termed here, which makes that which appears easy in war difficult in reality. As we proceed, we shall often meet with this subject again, and it will hereafter become plain that besides experience and a strong will, there are still many other rare qualities of mind required to make a man a consummate general. Chapter 8. Concluding Remarks, Book 1. Those things which as elements meet together in the atmosphere of war, and make it a resistant medium for every activity we have designated under the terms danger, bodily effort, exertion, information, and friction. In their impediment effects, they may therefore be comprehended again in the collective notion of a general friction. Now, is there then no kind of oil which is capable of diminishing this friction? Only one, and that one is not always available at the will of the commander or his army. It is the habituation of an army to war. Habit gives strength to the body in great exertion, to the mind in great danger, to the judgment against first impressions. By it a valuable circumspection is generally gained throughout every rank, from the hussar and rifleman up to the general of division, which facilitates the work of the chief commander. As the human eye in a dark room dilates its pupil, draws in the little light that there is, partially distinguishes objects by degrees, and at last knows them quite well, so it is in war with the experienced soldier, whilst the novice is only met by pitch-dark night. Habituation to war no general can give his army at once, and the camps of manoeuvre, peace exercises, furnish but a weak substitute for it, weak in comparison with real experience in war, but not weak in relation to other armies in which the training is limited to mere mechanical exercises of routine. So, to regulate the exercises in peacetime as to include some of these causes of friction, that the judgment, circumspection, even resolution of the separate leaders may be brought into exercise, is of much greater consequence than those believe who do not know the thing by experience. It is of immense importance that the soldier, high or low, whatever rank he has, should not have to encounter in war those things which, when seen first time, set him in astonishment and perplexity, if he has only met with them one single time before. Even by that, he is half acquainted with them. This relates even to bodily fatigues. They should be practiced less to accustom the body to them than the mind. In war, the young soldier is very apt to regard unusual fatigues as the consequence of faults, mistakes, and embarrassment in the conduct of the whole, and to become distressed and despondent as a consequence. This would not happen if he had been prepared for this beforehand by exercises in peace. Another less comprehensive, but still very important means of gaining habituation to war in time of peace is to invite into the service officers of foreign armies who have had experience in war. Peace seldom reigns over all Europe, and never in all quarters of the world. A state which has been long at peace should, therefore, always seek to procure some officers who have done good service at the different scenes of warfare, or to send some of their own, that they may get a lesson in war. However small the number of officers of this description may appear in proportion to the mass, still their influence is very sensibly felt. Their experience, the bent of their genius, the stamp of their character, influence their subordinates and comrades. And besides that, if they cannot be placed in positions of superior command, they may always be regarded as men acquainted with the country, who may be questioned on many special occasions. End of Book 1, Chapters 4 through 8. Book 2, Chapter 1 of On War. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Timothy Ferguson. On War by Karl von Clausewitz. Translated by Colonel J. J. Graham. Book 2, On the Theory of War, Chapter 1, Branches of the Art of War. War in its literal meaning is fighting, for fighting alone is the efficient principle in the manifold activity which in a wide sense is called war. But fighting is a trial of strength of the moral and physical forces by means of the latter. That the moral cannot be omitted is evident of itself, for the condition of the mind has always been the most decisive influence on the forces employed in war. The necessity of fighting very soon led men to special inventions to turn the advantage in it in their own favour. In consequence of these, the mode of fighting has undergone great alterations. But in whatever way it is conducted, its conception remains unaltered, and fighting is that which constitutes war. The inventions have been from the first weapons and equipments for the individual combatants. These have to be provided, and the use of them learnt before the war begins. They are made suitable to the nature of the fighting, consequently are ruled by it, but plainly, the activity engaged in these appliances is a different thing from the fight itself. It is only the preparation for the combat, not the conduct of the same. That arming and equipping are not essential to the conception of fighting is plain, because mere wrestling is also fighting. Fighting has determined everything appertaining to arms and equipment, and these in turn modify the mode of fighting. There is, therefore, a reciprocity of action between the two. Nevertheless, the fight itself remains still an entirely special activity, more particularly because it moves in an entirely special element, namely in the element of danger. If then there is anywhere a necessity for drawing a line between two different activities, it is here, and in order to see clearly the importance of this idea, we need only just to call to mind how often eminent personal fitness in one field has turned out nothing but the most useless pedantry in the other. It is also in no way difficult to separate in idea the one activity from the other. If we look at the combatant forces fully armed and equipped as a given means, the profitable use of which requires nothing more than a knowledge of the general results. The art of war is, therefore, in its proper sense, the art of making use of the given means in fighting, and we cannot give it a better name than the conduct of war. On the other hand, in a wider sense, all activities which have their existence on account of war, therefore the whole creation of troops, that is, levying them, arming, equipping, and exercising them, belong to the art of war. To make a sound theory, it is most essential to separate these two activities, for it is easy to see that if every act of war is to begin with the preparation of the military forces, and to presuppose forces so organized as a primary condition for conducting war, then theory will only be applicable in the few cases to which the force available happens to be exactly suited. If, on the other hand, we wish to have a theory which shall suit most cases, and will not be wholly useless in any case, it must be founded on those means which are in most general use, and in respect to these, only on the actual results springing from them. The conduct of war is, therefore, the formation and conduct of the fighting. If this fighting was a single act, there would be no necessity for any further subdivision, but the fight is composed of a greater or less number of single acts, complete in themselves, which we call combats, as we have shown in the first chapter of the book, and which form new units. From this arises the totally different activities, that of the formation and conduct of these single combats in themselves, and the combination of them with one another, with a view to the ultimate object of the war. The first is called tactics, the other strategy. This division into tactics and strategy is now in almost general use, and everyone knows tolerably well under which head to place any single fact, without knowing very distinctly the grounds on which the classification is founded. But when such divisions are blindly adhered to in practice, they must have some deep root. We have searched for this root, and we might say that it is just the usage of the majority which has brought us to it. On the other hand, we look upon the arbitrary, unnatural definitions of these conceptions, sought to be established by some writers as not in accordance with the general usage of the terms. According to our classification, therefore, tactics is the theory of the use of military forces in combat. Strategy is the theory of the use of combats for the object of the war. The way in which the conception of a single or independent combat is more closely determined, the conditions to which this unit is attached, we shall only be able to explain clearly when we consider the combat. We must content ourselves for the present with saying that in relation to space, therefore in combats taking place at the same time, the unit reaches just as far as personal command reaches. But in regard to time, and therefore in relation to combats which follow each other in close succession, it reaches to the moment when the crisis which takes place in every combat is entirely past. That doubtful cases may occur, cases, for instance, in which several combats may perhaps be regarded as a single one, will not overthrow the ground of distinction we have adopted. But the same is the case with all grounds of distinction of real things which are differentiated by a gradually diminishing scale. There may, therefore, certainly be acts of activity in war which, without any alteration in the point of view, may just as well be counted strategic as tactical. For example, very extended positions resembling a chain of posts, the preparations for the passage of a river at several points, and such. Our classification reaches and covers only the use of military force. But now there are in war a number of activities which are subservient to it, and are still quite different from it, sometimes closely allied, sometimes less near in their affinity. All these activities relate to the maintenance of the military force. In the same way as its creation and training precede its use, so its maintenance is always a necessary condition. But, strictly viewed, all activities thus connected with it are always to be regarded only as preparations for fighting. They are certainly nothing more than activities which are very close to the action, so that they run through the hostile act, alternate in importance with the use of forces. We have therefore a right to exclude them, as well as the other preparatory activities, from the art of war in its restricted sense, from the conduct of war properly so called, and we are obliged to do so if we would comply with the first principle of all theory, the elimination of all heterogeneous elements. Who would include in the real conduct of war the whole litany of subsistence and administration, because it is admitted to stand in constant reciprocal action with the use of the troops, but is something essentially different from it. We have said in the 3rd chapter of our first book that as the fight or combat is the only directly effective activity, therefore the threads of all others, as they end in it, are included in it. By this we mean to say that to all others an object was thereby appointed which, in accordance with the laws peculiar to themselves, they must seek to attain. Here we must go a little closer into this subject. The subjects which constitute the activities outside of the combat are of various kinds. The one part belongs in one respect to the combat itself, is identical with it, whilst it serves in another respect for the maintenance of the military force. The other part belongs purely to the subsistence, and has only, in consequence of reciprocal action, a limited influence on the combats by its results. The subjects which in one respect belong to the fighting itself are marches, camps, and cantonments, for they suppose so many different situations of troops, and where troops are supposed, there the idea of the combat must always be present. The other subjects, which only belong to the maintenance, are subsistence, care of the sick, supply and repair of arms and equipment. Marches are quite identical with the use of the troops. The act of marching in the combat, generally called manoeuvring, does not necessarily include the use of weapons, but it is so completely and necessarily combined with it that it forms an integral part of that which we call a combat. But the march outside the combat is nothing but the execution of a strategic measure. By the strategic plan is settled when, where, and with what forces a battle is to be delivered, and to carry that into execution, the march is the only means. The march outside of the combat is therefore an instrument of strategy, but not on that account exclusively a subject of strategy, for as the armed force which executes it may be involved in a possible combat at any moment, therefore its execution stands also under tactical as well as strategic rules. If we prescribe to a column its route on a particular side of a river, or of a branch of a mountain, then that is a strategic measure, for it contains the intention of fighting on that particular side of the hill or river in preference to the other, in case a combat should be necessary during the march. But if a column, instead of following the road through a valley, marches along the parallel ridge of heights, or for the convenience of marching, divides itself into several columns, then these are tactical arrangements, for they relate to the matter in which we shall use the troops in the anticipated combat. The particular order of march is in constant relation with readiness for combat, is therefore tactical in its nature, for it is nothing more than the first or preliminary disposition for the battle which may possibly take place. As the march is the instrument by which strategy apportions its active elements, the combats, but these last often only appear by their results and not in the details of their real course, it could not fail to happen that in theory the instrument has often been substituted for the efficient principle. Thus we hear of a decisive, skilful march, allusion being thereby made to those combat combinations to which these marches led. This substitution of ideas is too natural, and conciseness of expression too desirable, to call for alteration, but still it is only a condensed chain of ideas, in regard to which we must never omit to bear in mind the full meaning, if we would avoid falling into error. We fall into error of this description if we attribute to strategical combinations a power independent of tactical results. We read of marches and manoeuvres combined, the object attained, and at the same time not a word about combat, from which the conclusion is drawn that there are means in war of conquering an enemy without fighting. The prolific nature of this error we cannot show until hereafter. But although a march can be regarded absolutely as an integral part of the combat, still there are in it certain relations which do not belong to the combat, and therefore are neither tactical nor strategic. To these belong all arrangements which concern only the accommodation of the troops, the construction of bridges, roads, and such. These are only conditions. Under many circumstances they are in very close connection, and may almost identify themselves with the troops, as in the building of a bridge in the presence of the enemy, but in themselves they are always activities, the theory of which does not form part of the theory of the conduct of war. Camps, by which we mean every disposition of troops in concentrated, therefore in battle order, in contradistinction to cantonments or quarters, are a state of rest, therefore of restoration, but they are at the same time also the strategic appointment of a battle on the spot chosen, and by the manner in which they are taken up they contain the fundamental lines of a battle, a condition from which every defensive battle starts. They are therefore essential parts of both strategy and tactics. Cantonments take the place of camps for the better refreshment of the troops. They are therefore, like camps, strategic subjects as regards position and extent, tactical subjects as regards internal organization, with a view to readiness to fight. The occupation of camps and cantonments no doubt usually combines with the recuperation of the troops another object also, for example, the covering of a district of country, the holding of a position, but it can very well be only the first. We remind our readers that strategy may follow a great diversity of objects, for everything which appears an advantage may be the object of a combat, and the preservation of the instrument with which war is made must necessarily very often become the object of its partial combinations. If, therefore, in such a case, strategy ministers only to the maintenance of the troops, we are not on that account out of the field of strategy, for we are still engaged with the use of the military force, because every disposition of that force upon any point whatever of the theatre of war is such a use. But if the maintenance of the troops in camp or quarters calls forth activities which are no employment of the armed force, such as the construction of huts, pitching of tents, subsistence and sanitary service in camps or quarters, then such belong neither to strategy nor tactics. Even entrenchments, the site and preparation of which are plainly part of the order of battle, therefore tactical subjects, do not belong to the theory of the conduct of war so far as respects the execution of their construction, the knowledge and skill required for such work being, in point of fact, qualities inherent in the nature of an organized army. The theory of the combat takes them for granted. Among the subjects which belong to the mere keeping up of an armed force, because none of the parts are identified with the combat, the victualling of the troops themselves comes first, as it must be done almost daily and for each individual. Thus it is that it completely permeates military action in the parts constituting strategy. We say parts constituting strategy because during a battle the subsistence of troops will rarely have any influence in modifying the plan, although the thing is conceivable enough. The care for the subsistence of the troops comes therefore into reciprocal action, chiefly with strategy, and there is nothing more common than for the leading strategic features of a campaign and war to be traced out in connection with a view to this supply. But however frequent and however important these views of supply must be, the subsistence of the troops always remains a completely different activity from the use of the troops, and the former has only an influence on the latter by its results. The other branches of administrative activity which have been mentioned stand much farther apart from the use of the troops. The care of the sick and wounded, highly important as it is for the good of an army, directly affects it only in a small portion of the individuals composing it, and therefore has only a weak and indirect influence upon the use of the rest. The completing and replacing articles of equipment, except as so far by the organism of the forces it constitutes a continuous activity inherent in them, takes place only periodically and therefore seldom affects strategic plans. We must, however, here guard ourselves against a mistake. In certain cases these subjects may be really of decisive importance. The distance of hospitals and depots of munitions may very easily be imagined as the sole cause of very important strategic decisions. We do not wish either to contest that point or to throw it into the shade, but we are at present occupied not with the particular facts of a concrete case, but with the abstract theory, and our assertion, therefore, is that such an influence is too rare to give the theory of sanitary measures and the supply of munitions and arms an importance in the theory of the conduct of war, such as to make it worthwhile to include in the theory of the conduct of war the consideration of the different ways and systems which the above theories may furnish, in the same way as is certainly necessary in regard to victualling troops. If we have clearly understood the results of our reflections, then the activities belonging to war divide themselves into two principal classes, into such as are only preparations for war, and into the war itself. This division must therefore also be made in theory. The knowledge and applications of skill in the preparations for war are engaged in the creation, discipline, and maintenance of all the military forces. What general name should be given to them we do not enter into, but we see that artillery, fortification, elementary tactics as they are called, the whole organization and administration of the various armed forces, and all such things are included. But the theory of war itself occupies itself with the use of these prepared means for the object of the war. It needs of the first only the results, that is, the knowledge of the principal properties of the means taken in hand for use. This we call the art of war in a limited sense, or the theory of the conduct of war, or theory of the employment of armed forces, all of them denoting for us the same thing. The present theory will therefore treat the combat as the real contest, marches, camps, and cantonments as circumstances which are more or less identical with it. The subsistence of the troops will only come into consideration like other given circumstances in respect of its results, not as an activity belonging to the combat. The art of war, thus viewed in its limited sense, divides itself again into tactics and strategy, The former occupies itself with the form of the separate combat, the latter with its use. Both connect themselves with the circumstances of marches, camps, cantonments, only through the combat, and these circumstances are tactical or strategic according as they relate to the form or to the signification of the battle. No doubt there will be many readers who will consider superfluous this careful separation of two things lying so close together as tactics and strategy, because it has no direct effect on the conduct itself of war. We admit certainly that it would be pedantry to look for direct effects on the field of battle from a theoretical distinction. But the first business of every theory is to clear up conceptions and ideas which have been jumbled together and, we may say, entangled and confused. And only when a right understanding is established as to the names and conceptions can we hope to progress with clearness and facility, and be certain that author and reader will always see things from the same point of view. Tactics and strategy are two activities mutually permeating each other in time and space, at the same time essentially different activities, the inner laws and mutual relations of which cannot be intelligible at all to the mind until a clear conception of the nature of each activity is established. He to whom all this is nothing must either repudiate all theoretical consideration, or his understanding has not yet been pained by the confused and perplexing ideas resting on no fixed point of view, leading to no satisfactory result, sometimes dull, sometimes fantastic, sometimes floating in vague generalities, which we are obliged to hear and read on the conduct of war, owing to the spirit of scientific investigation having hitherto been little directed to these subjects. End of Book 2, Chapter 1. Recording by Timothy Ferguson, Gold Coast, Australia. Book 2, Chapter 2 of On War, by Karl von Clausewitz. Book 2, Chapter 2, On the Theory of War. 1. The first conception of the art of war was merely the preparation of the armed forces. Formerly, by the term art of war or science of war, nothing was understood but the totality of those branches of knowledge and those appliances of skill occupied with material things. The pattern and preparation and mode of using arms, the construction of fortifications and entrenchments, the organism of an army and the mechanism of its movements were the subject. These branches of knowledge and skill above referred to, and the end and aim of them all, was the establishment of an armed force, fit for use in war. All this concerned merely things belonging to the material world, and a one-sided activity only, and it was in fact nothing but an activity advancing by gradations from the lower occupations to a finer kind of mechanical art. The relation of all this to war itself was very much the same as the relation of the art of the sword cutler to the art of using the sword. The employment in the moment of danger, and in a state of constant reciprocal action of the particular energies of mind and spirit in the direction proposed to them, was not yet even mooted. 2. True war first appears in the art of sieges. In the art of sieges we first perceive a certain degree of guidance of the combat, something of the action of the intellectual faculties upon the material forces placed under their control, but generally only so far that it was very soon embodied itself again in new material forms, such as approaches, trenches, counter-approaches, batteries and such, and every step which this action of the higher faculties took was marked by some such result. It was only the thread that was required on which to string these material inventions in order. As the intellect can hardly manifest itself in this kind of war, except in such things, so therefore nearly all that was necessary was done in that way. 3. Then tactics tried to find its way in the same direction. Afterwards tactics attempted to give to the mechanism of its joints the character of a general disposition, built upon the peculiar properties of the instrument, which character leads indeed to the battlefield, but instead of leading to the free activity of mind, leads to an army made like an automaton by its rigid formation and orders of battle, which, movable only by the word of command, is intended to unwind its activities like a piece of clockwork. 4. The real conduct of war only made its appearance incidentally and incognito. The conduct of war properly so called, that is, the use of a prepared means adapted to the most special requirements, was not considered as any suitable subject for theory, but one which should be left to natural talents alone. By degrees, as war passed from the hand-to-hand encounters of the Middle Ages into a more regular and systematic form, stray reflections on this point also forced themselves into men's minds, but they mostly appeared only incidentally in memoirs and narratives, and in a certain measure incognito. Reflections on military events brought about the want of a theory. As contemplation on war continually increased, and its history every day assumed more of a critical character, the urgent want appeared of the support of fixed maxims and rules, in order that, in the controversies naturally arising about military events, the war of opinions might be brought to some one point. This whirl of opinions, which neither revolved on any central pivot, nor according to any appreciable laws, could not but be very distasteful to people's minds. 6. Endeavours to establish a positive theory. There arose, therefore, an endeavour to establish maxims, rules, and even systems for the conduct of war. By this the attainment of a positive object was proposed, without taking into view the endless difficulties which the conduct of war presents in that respect. The conduct of war, as we have shown, has no definite limits in any direction, while every system has the circumscribing nature of a synthesis, from which results an irreconcilable opposition between such a theory and practice. 7. Limitation to material objects. Writers on theory felt the difficulty of the subject soon enough, and thought themselves entitled to get rid of it by directing their maxims and systems only upon material things and on a one-sided activity. Their aim was to reach results, as in the science for the preparation for war, entirely certain and positive, and therefore only to take into consideration that which could be made a matter of calculation. 8. Superiority of numbers. The superiority in numbers being a material condition, it was chosen from amongst all the factors required to produce victory, because it could be brought under mathematical laws through combinations of time and space. It was thought possible to leave out of sight all other circumstances, by supposing them to be equal on each side, and therefore to neutralize one another. This would have been very well if it had been done to gain a preliminary knowledge of this one factor according to its relations, but to make it a rule forever to consider a superiority of numbers as the sole law, to see the whole secret of the art of war in the formula, in a certain time, at a certain point, to bring up superior masses, was a restriction overruled by the force of realities. 9. Victualling of troops. By one theoretical school an attempt was made to systematize another element also, by making the subsistence of troops, according to a previously established organism of the army, the supreme legislator in the higher conduct of war. In this way, certainly, they arrived at definite figures, but at figures which rested on a number of arbitrary calculations, and which therefore could not stand the test of practical application. 10. Base. An ingenious author tried to concentrate in a single conception, that of base, a whole host of objects, amongst which sundry relations, even with immaterial forces, found their way in as well. This list comprised the subsistence of the troops, the keeping them complete in numbers and equipment, the security of communications from the home country, lastly, the security of retreat, in case it became necessary, and first of all he proposed to substitute this conception of a base for all these things, then for the base itself to substitute its own length, extent, and, last of all, to substitute the angle formed by the army with this base. All this was done to obtain a pure geometrical result, utterly useless. This last is, in fact, unavoidable if we reflect that none of these substitutions could be made without violating truth and leaving out some of the things contained in the original conception. The idea of a base is a real necessity for strategy, and to have it conceived is meritorious, but to make such a use of it as we have depicted is completely inadmissible, and could not but lead to partial conclusions, which have forced these theorists into a direction opposed to common sense, namely a belief in the decisive effect of the enveloping form of attack. 11. Interior lines. As a reaction against this false direction, another geometrical principle, that of the so-called interior lines, was then elevated to the throne. Although this principle rests on a sound foundation, on the truth that the combat is the only effectual means in war, still it is, just on account of its purely geometrical nature, nothing but another case of one-sided theory which can never gain ascendancy in the real world. 12. All these attempts are open to objection. All these attempts at theory are only to be considered in their analytical part as progress in the province of truth, but in their synthetical part, in their precepts and rules, they are quite unserviceable. They strive after determinate quantities, whilst in war all is undetermined, and the calculation has always to be made with varying quantities. They direct the attention only upon material forces, while the whole military action is penetrated throughout by intelligent forces and their effects. They only pay regard to activity on one side, whilst war is a constant state of reciprocal action, the effects of which are mutual. 13. As a rule, they exclude genius. All that was not attainable by such miserable philosophy, the offspring of partial views, lay outside the precincts of science, and was the field of genius, which raises itself above rules. Pity the warrior who is contented to crawl about in this beggardom of rules, which are too bad for genius, over which it can set itself superior, over which it can perchance make merry. What genius does must be the best of all rules, and the theory cannot do better than to show how and why it is so. Pity the theory which sets itself in opposition to the mind. It cannot repair this contradiction by any humility, and the humbler it is, so much the sooner will ridicule and contempt drive it out of real life. 14. The difficulty of theory as soon as moral quantities come into consideration. Every theory becomes infinitely more difficult from the moment that it touches on the province of moral quantities. Architecture and painting know quite well what they are about, as long as they have only to do with matter. There is no dispute about mechanical or optical construction, but as soon as the moral activities begin their work, as soon as moral impressions and feelings are produced, the whole set of rules dissolves into vague ideas. The science of medicine is chiefly engaged with bodily phenomena only. Its business is with the animal organism, which, liable to perpetual change, is never exactly the same for 2 moments. This makes its practice very difficult, and places the judgment of the physician above his science. How much more difficult is the case if a moral effect is added, and how much higher must we place the physician of the mind. 15. The moral quantities must not be excluded in war. But now the activity in war is never directed solely against matter. It is always at the same time directed against the intelligent force which gives life to this matter, and to separate the two from each other is impossible. But the intelligent forces are only visible to the inner eye, and this is different in each person, and often different in the same person at different times. As danger is the general element in which everything moves in war, it is also chiefly by courage, the feeling of one's own power, that the judgment is differently influenced. It is to a certain extent the crystalline lens through which all appearances pass before reaching the understanding. And yet we cannot doubt that these things acquire a certain objective value simply through experience. Everyone knows the moral effect of a surprise, of an attack in flank or rear. Everyone thinks less of the enemy's courage as soon as he turns his back, and ventures much more in pursuit than when pursued. Everyone judges of the enemy's general by his reputed talents, by his age and experience, and shapes his course accordingly. Everyone casts a scrutinizing glance at the spirit and feeling of his own and the enemy's troops. All these and similar effects in the province of the moral nature of man have established themselves by experience, are perpetually recurring, and therefore warrant our reckoning them as real qualities of their kind. What could we do with any theory which should leave them out of consideration? Certainly experience is an indispensable title for these truths. With psychological and philosophical sophistries, no theory, no general, should meddle. 16. Principal difficulty of a theory for the conduct of war. In order to comprehend clearly the difficulty of the proposition which is contained in a theory for the conduct of war, and thence to deduce the necessary characteristics of such a theory, we must take a closer view of the chief particulars which make up the nature of the activity in war. 17. First speciality, moral forces and their effects, hostile feeling. The first of these specialities consists in the moral forces and effects. The combat is, in its origin, the expression of hostile feeling. But in our great combats, which we call wars, the hostile feeling frequently resolves itself into merely a hostile view, and there is usually no innate hostile feeling residing in individual against individual. Nevertheless, the combat never passes off without such feelings being brought into activity. National hatred, which is seldom wanting in our wars, is a substitute for personal hostility in the breast of individual opposed to individual. But where this is also wanting, and at first no animosity of feeling subsists, a hostile feeling is kindled by the combat itself. For an act of violence which anyone commits upon us, by order of his superior, will excite in us a desire to retaliate and be revenged on him, sooner than on the superior power at whose command the act was done. This is human, or animal if we will, still it is so. We are very apt to regard the combat in theory as an abstract trial of strength, without any participation on the part of the feelings, and that is one of the 1,000 errors which theorists deliberately commit because they do not see its consequences. Besides the excitation of feelings naturally arising from the combat itself, there are others also which do not essentially belong to it, but which, on account of their relationship, easily unite with it. Ambition, love of power, enthusiasm of every kind, and such. 18. The impressions of danger, courage. Finally, the combat begets the element of danger, in which all activities of war must live and move, like the bird in the air or the fish in the water. But the influences of danger all pass into the feelings, either directly, that is, instinctively, or through the medium of the understanding. The effect in the first case would be a desire to escape from danger, and, if that cannot be done, fright and anxiety. If this effect does not take place, then it is courage, which is a counterpoise to that instinct. Courage is, however, by no means an act of the understanding, but likewise a feeling, like fear. The latter looks to the physical preservation, courage to the moral preservation. Courage, then, is a nobler instinct, but because it is so, it will not allow itself to be used as a lifeless instrument, which produces its effects exactly according to prescribed measure. Courage is therefore no mere counterpoise to danger in order to neutralize the latter in its effects, but a peculiar power in itself. 19. The extent of the influence of danger. But to estimate exactly the influence of danger upon the principal actors in war, we must not limit its sphere to the physical danger of the moment. It dominates over the actor, not only by threatening him, but also by threatening all entrusted to him, not only at the moment in which it is actually present, but also through the imagination at all other moments which have a connection with the present. Lastly, but also indirectly by the responsibility which makes it bear with tenfold weight on the mind of the chief actor, who could advise or resolve upon a great battle without feeling his mind more or less wrought up or perplexed by the danger and responsibility which such a great act of decision carries in itself. We may say that action in war, in so far as it is real action, not a mere condition, is never out of the sphere of danger. 20. Other powers of feeling. If we look upon these affections which are excited by hostility and danger as peculiarly belonging to war, we do not therefore exclude from it all others accompanying man in his life's journey. They will also find room here frequently enough. Certainly we may say that many a petty action of the passions is silenced in this serious business of life. But that holds good only in respect to those acting in a lower sphere, who, hurried on from one state of danger and exertion to another, lose sight of the rest of the things of life, become unused to deceit, because it is of no avail with death, and so attain to that soldierly simplicity of character which has always been the best representative of the military profession. In higher regions it is otherwise. For the higher a man's rank, the more he must look around him. Then arise interests on every side, and a manifold activity of the passions of good and bad, envy and generosity, pride and humility, fierceness and tenderness, all may appear as active powers in this great drama. 21. Peculiarity of the mind. The peculiar characteristics of mind in the chief actor have, as well as those of the feelings, a high importance. From an imaginative, flighty, inexperienced head, and from a calm, sagacious understanding, different things are to be expected. 22. From the diversity in mental individualities arises the diversity of ways leading to the end. It is this great diversity in mental individuality, the influence of which is supposed to be chiefly felt in the higher ranks, because it increases as we progress upwards, which chiefly produces the diversity of ways leading to the end noticed by us in the first book, and which gives to the play of possibilities and chance such an unequal share in determining the course of events. 23. Second peculiarity, living reaction. The second peculiarity in war is the living reaction and the reciprocal action resulting therefrom. We do not here speak of the difficulty of estimating that reaction, for that is included in the difficulty before mentioned of treating the moral powers as quantities, but of this, that reciprocal action, by its nature, opposes anything like a regular plan. The effect which any measure produces upon the enemy is the most distinct of all the data which action affords, but every theory must keep to classes or groups of phenomena, and can never take up the really individual case in itself, that must everywhere be left to judgment and talent. It is therefore natural that in a business such as war, which in its plan, built upon general circumstances, is so often thwarted by unexpected and singular accidents, more must generally be left to talent, and less use can be made of a theoretical guide than in any other. 24. Third peculiarity, uncertainty of all data. Lastly, the great uncertainty of all data in war is a peculiar difficulty, because all action must, to a certain extent, be planned in a mere twilight, which, in addition, not unfrequently, like the effect of a fog or moonshine, gives to things exaggerated dimensions and an unnatural appearance. What this feeble light leaves indistinct to the sight, talent must discover, or must be left to chance. It is therefore again talent, or the favour of fortune, on which reliance must be placed, for want of objective knowledge. 25. Positive theory is impossible. With materials of this kind, we can only say to ourselves that it is a sheer impossibility to construct for the art of war a theory which, like a scaffolding, shall ensure to the chief actor an external support on all sides. In those cases in which he is thrown upon his talent, he would find himself away from this scaffolding of theory and in opposition to it, and, however many-sided it might be framed, the same result would ensue, which we spoke of when we said that talent and genius act beyond the law, and theory is in opposition to reality. 26. Means by which a theory is possible. The difficulties are not everywhere equally great. Two means present themselves of getting out of this difficulty. In the first place, what we have said of the nature of military action in general does not apply in the same matter to the action of every one, whatever may be his standing. In the lower ranks, the spirit of self-sacrifice is called more into request, but the difficulties which the understanding and judgment meet with are infinitely less. The field of occurrences is more confined, ends and means are fewer in number, data more distinct, mostly also contained in the actually visible. But the higher we ascend, the more the difficulties increase, until in the Commander-in-Chief they reach their climax, so that with him almost everything must be left to genius. Further, according to a division of the subject in agreement with its nature, the difficulties are not everywhere the same, but diminish the more results manifest themselves in the material world, and increase the more they pass into the moral, and become motives which influence the will. Therefore it is easier to determine by theoretical rules the order and conduct of a battle than the use to be made of the battle itself. Yonder physical weapons clash with each other, and although mind is not wanting therein, matter must have its rights. But in the effects to be produced by battles, when the material results become motives, we have only to do with the moral nature. In a word, it is easier to make a theory for tactics than for strategy. 27. Theory must be of the nature of observations, not of doctrine. The second opening for the possibility of a theory lies in the point of view that it does not necessarily require to be a direction for action. As a general rule, whenever an activity is for the most part occupied with the same objects over and over again, with the same ends and means, although there may be trifling alterations and a corresponding number of varieties of combination, such things are capable of becoming a subject of study for the reasoning faculties. But such study is just the most essential part of every theory, and has a peculiar title to that name. It is an analytical investigation of the subject that leads to an exact knowledge, and if brought to bear on the results of experience, which in our case would be military history, to a thorough familiarity with it. The nearer theory attains the latter object, so much more it passes over from the objective form of knowledge into the subjective one of skill in action, and so much the more, therefore, will it prove itself effective when circumstances allow for no other decision but that of personal talents. It will show its effects in that talent itself. If theory investigates the subjects which constitute war, if it separates more distinctly that which at first sight seems amalgamated, if it explains fully the properties of the means, if it shows their probable effects, if it makes evident the nature of objects, if it brings to bear all over the field of war the light of essentially critical investigation, then it has fulfilled the chief duties of its province. If it becomes then a guide to him who wishes to make himself acquainted with war from books, it lights up the whole road for him, facilitates his progress, educates his judgment, and shields him from error. If a man of expertness spends half his life in the endeavour to clear up an obscure subject thoroughly, he will probably know more about it than a person who seeks to master it in a short time. Theory is instituted that each person in succession may not have to go through the same labour of clearing the ground and toiling through each subject, but may find the thing in order and light admitted on it. It should educate the mind of the future leader in war, or rather guide him in his self-instruction, but not accompany him to the field of battle, just as a sensible tutor forms and enlightens the opening mind of a youth without, therefore, keeping him in leading strings all through his life. If maxims and rules result of themselves from the considerations which theory institutes, if the truth accretes itself into that form of crystal, then theory will not oppose this natural law of the mind. It will rather, if the arch ends in such a keystone, bring it prominently out. But so does this only to satisfy the philosophical law of reason, in order to show distinctly the point to which the lines all converge, not to form out of it an algebraical formula for use upon the battlefield, for even these maxims and rules serve more to determine in the reflecting mind the leading outline of its habitual movements than as landmarks, indicating to it the way in the act of execution. 28. By this point of view, theory becomes possible and ceases to be in contradiction to practice. Taking this point of view, there is a possibility afforded of a satisfactory, that is, of a useful, theory of the conduct of war, never coming into opposition with the reality, and it will only depend on rational treatment to bring it so far into harmony with action that between theory and practice there shall no longer be that absurd difference which an unreasonable theory, in defiance of common sense, has often produced, but which, just as often, narrow-mindedness and ignorance have used as a pretext for giving way to their natural incapacity. 29. Theory therefore considers the nature of ends and means in tactics. Theory has therefore to consider the nature of means and ends. In tactics, the means are the disciplined armed forces which are to carry the contest. The object is victory. The precise definition of this conception can be better explained hereafter in the consideration of the combat. Here we content ourselves by denoting the retirement of the enemy from the field of battle as the sign of victory. By means of this victory, strategy gains the object for which it appointed the combat, and which constitutes its special signification. This signification has certainly some influence on the nature of the victory. A victory which is intended to weaken the enemy's armed forces is a different thing from one which is designed only to put us in possession of a position. The signification of a combat may, therefore, have a sensible influence on the preparation and conduct of it. Consequently, will be also a subject of consideration in tactics. 30. Circumstances which always attend the application of the means. As there are certain circumstances which attend the combat throughout, and have more or less influence upon its result, therefore these must be taken into consideration in the application of the armed forces. These circumstances are the locality of the combat, ground, the time of day, and the weather. 31. Locality. The locality, which we prefer leaving for solution under the head of country and ground, might, strictly speaking, be without any influence at all if the combat took place on a completely level and uncultivated plain. In a country of steppes, such a case may occur, but in the cultivated countries of Europe, it is almost an imaginary idea. Therefore, a combat between civilized nations in which country and ground have no influence is hardly conceivable. 32. Time of day. The time of day influences the combat by the difference between day and night, but the influence naturally extends further than merely to the limits of these divisions, as every combat has a certain duration, and great battles last for several hours. In the preparations for a great battle, it makes an essential difference whether it begins in the morning or the evening. At the same time, certainly many battles have been fought in which the question of the time of day is quite immaterial, and in the generality of cases, its influence is only trifling. 33. Weather. Still more rarely has the weather any decisive influence, and it is mostly only by fogs that it plays a part. 34. End and means in strategy. Strategy has in the first instance only the victory, that is, the tactical result, as a means to its object, and ultimately those things which lead directly to peace. The application of its means to this object is at the same time attended by circumstances which have an influence thereon more or less. 35. Circumstances which attend the application of the means of strategy. These circumstances are country and ground, the former including the territory and inhabitants of the whole theatre of war, the next the time of day and the time of year as well, lastly the weather, particularly any unusual state of the same, severe frost and such. 36. These form new means. By bringing these things into combination with the results of a combat, strategy gives this result, and therefore the combat, a special signification, places before it a particular object. But when this object is not that which leads directly to peace, therefore a subordinate one, it is only to be looked upon as a means, and therefore in strategy we may look upon the results of combats or victories in all their different significations as means. The conquest of a position is such a result of a combat applied to ground. But not only are there different combats with special objects to be considered as means, but also every higher aim which we may have in view in the combination of battles directed on a common object is to be regarded as a means. A winter campaign is a combination of this kind applied to the season. There remain, therefore, as objects only those things which may be supposed as leading directly to peace. Theory investigates all these ends and means according to the nature of their effects and their mutual relations. 37. Strategy deduces only from experience the ends and means to be examined. The first question is, how much does strategy arrive at a complete list of these things? If there is to be a philosophical inquiry leading to an absolute result, it would become entangled in all those difficulties which the logical necessity of the conduct of war and its theory exclude. It therefore turns to experience and directs its attention on those combinations which military history can furnish. In this manner, no doubt, nothing more than a limited theory can be obtained, which suits only circumstances such as are presented in history, but this incompleteness is unavoidable, because, in any case, theory must either have deduced from, or have compared with, history what it advances with respect to things. Besides this, incompleteness, in every case, is more theoretical than real. One great advantage of this method is that theory cannot lose itself in abstruse disquisitions, subtleties, and chimeras, but must always remain practical. 38. How far the analysis of the means should be carried. Another question is, how far should theory go in its analysis of the means? Evidently only so far as the elements, in a separate form, present themselves for consideration in practice. The range and effect of different weapons is very important to tactics. Their construction, although these effects result from it, is a matter of indifference. For the conduct of war is not making powder and cannon out of a given quantity of charcoal, sulphur, and saltpeter, of copper and tin. The given quantities for the conduct of war are arms in a finished state and their effects. Strategy makes use of maps without troubling itself about triangulations. It does not inquire how a country is subdivided into departments and provinces, and how the people are educated and governed, in order to attain the best military results. But it takes things as it finds them in the community of European states, and observes where very different conditions have a notable influence on war. 39. Great simplification of the knowledge required. That in this manner the number of subjects for theory is much simplified, and the knowledge requisite for the conduct of war much reduced, is easy to perceive. The very great mass of knowledge and appliances of skill which minister to the action of war in general, and which are necessary before an army fully equipped can take the field, unite in a few great results before they are able to reach, in actual war, the final goal of their activity. Just as the streams of a country unite themselves in rivers before they fall into the sea. Only those activities emptying themselves directly into the sea of war have to be studied by him who is to conduct their operations. 40. This explains the rapid growth of great generals, and why a general is not a man of learning. This result of our considerations is, in fact, so necessary, any other would have made us distrustful of their accuracy. Only thus is explained how, so often, men have made their appearance with great success in war, and indeed in the higher ranks, even in supreme command, whose pursuits had been previously of a totally different nature. Indeed, how, as a rule, the most distinguished generals have never arisen from the very learned or really erudite class of officers, but have been mostly men who, from the circumstances of their position, could not have attained any great amount of knowledge. On that account, those who have considered it necessary, or even beneficial, to commence the education of a future general by instruction in all details have always been ridiculed as absurd pedants. It would be easy to show the injurious tendency of such a course, because the human mind is trained by the knowledge imparted to it, and the direction given to its ideas. Only what is great can make it great. The little can only make it little, if a mind itself does not reject it as something repugnant. 41. Former contradictions. Because this simplicity of knowledge requisite in war was not attended to, but the knowledge was always jumbled up with the whole impediments of subordinate sciences and arts, therefore the palpable opposition to the events of real life which resulted could not be solved otherwise than by ascribing it all to genius, which requires no theory, and for which no theory could be prescribed. 42. On this account all use of knowledge was denied, and everything ascribed to natural talents. People with whom common sense had the upper hand felt sensible of the immense distance remaining to be filled up between a genius of the highest order and a learned pedant, and they became, in a manner, free thinkers, rejected all belief in theory, and affirmed the conduct of war to be a natural function of man, which he performs more or less well, according as he has brought with him into the world more or less talent in that direction. It cannot be denied that these were nearer to the truth than those who placed a value on false knowledge. At the same time, it may easily be seen that such a view is itself but an exaggeration. No activity of the human understanding is possible without a certain stock of ideas, but these are, for the greater part at least, not innate but acquired, and constitute his knowledge. The only question, therefore, is, of what kind should these ideas be? And we think we have answered it if we say that they should be directed on those things which man has directly to deal with in war. 43. The knowledge must be made suitable to the position. Inside this field itself of military activity, the knowledge required must be different according to the station of the commander. It will be directed on smaller and more circumscribed objects if he holds an inferior, upon greater and more comprehensive ones if he holds a higher situation. There are field marshals who would not have shone at the head of a cavalry regiment, and vice versa. 44. The knowledge of war is simple, but not, at the same time, very easy. But, although the knowledge in war is simple, that is to say, directed to so few subjects, and taking up those only in their final results, the art of execution is not, on that account, easy. Of the difficulties to which activity in war is subject generally, we have already spoken in the first book. We here omit those things which can only be overcome by courage, and maintain also that the activity of the mind is only simple and easy in inferior stations, but increases in difficulty with increase in rank, and in the highest position, in that of Commander-in-Chief, is to be reckoned among the most difficult which there is for the human mind. 45. Of the nature of this knowledge. The commander of an army neither requires to be a learned explorer of history, nor a publicist, but he must be well versed in the higher affairs of state. He must know and be able to judge correctly of traditional tendencies, interests at stake, the immediate questions at issue, and the characters of leading persons. He need not be a close observer of men, a sharp dissector of human character, but he must know the character, the feelings, the habits, the peculiar faults and inclinations of those whom he is to command. He need not understand anything about the make of a carriage, or the harness of a battery horse, but he must know how to calculate exactly the march of a column under different circumstances, according to the time it requires. These are matters the knowledge of which cannot be forced out by an apparatus of scientific formula and machinery. They are only to be gained by the exercise of an accurate judgment in the observation of things and of men, aided by a special talent for the apprehension of both. The necessary knowledge for a higher position in military action is therefore distinguished by this, that by observation, therefore by study and reflection, it is only to be attained through a special talent which as an intellectual instinct understands how to extract from the phenomena of life only the essence or spirit, as bees do honey from the flowers, and that it is also to be gained by experience of life as well as by study and reflection. Life will never bring forth a Newton or a Euler by its rich teachings, but it may bring forth great calculators in war, such as Conde or Frederick. It is therefore not necessary that, in order to vindicate the intellectual dignity of military activity, we should resort to untruth and silly pedantry. There has never been a great and distinguished commander of contracted mind, but very numerous are the instances of men who, after serving with the greatest distinction in inferior positions, remained below mediocrity in the highest, from insufficiency of intellectual capacity. That even amongst those holding the position of Commander-in-Chief, there may be a difference according to the degree of their plenitude of power, is a matter of course. 46. Science must become art. Now we have yet to consider one condition which is more necessary for the knowledge of the conduct of war than any other, which is, that it must pass completely into the mind and almost completely cease to be something objective. In almost all other arts and occupations of life, the active agent can make use of truths which he has learnt only once, and in the spirit and sense of which he no longer lives, and which he extracts from dusty books. Even truths which he has had in hand and uses daily may continue something external to himself. If the architect takes up a pen to settle the strength of a pier by a complicated calculation, the truth found as a result is no emanation from his own mind. He had first to find the data with labour, and then to submit these to an operation of the mind, the rule of which he did not discover, the necessity of which he is perhaps at the moment only partially conscious of, but which he applies, for the most part, as if by mechanical dexterity. But it is never so in war. The moral reaction, the ever-changing form of things, makes it necessary for the chief actor to carry in himself the whole mental apparatus of his knowledge, that anywhere and at every pulse beat he may be capable of giving the requisite decision from himself. Knowledge must, by this complete assimilation with his own mind and life, be converted into real power. This is the reason why everything seems so easy with men distinguished in war, and why everything is ascribed to natural talent. We say natural talent in order thereby to distinguish it from that which is formed and matured by observation and study. We think that by these reflections we have explained the problem of a theory of the conduct of war, and pointed out the way to its solution. Of the two fields into which we have divided the conduct of war, tactics and strategy, the theory of the latter contains unquestionably, as before observed, the greatest difficulties, because the first is almost limited to a circumscribed field of objects, but the latter, in the direction of objects leading directly to peace, opens itself an unlimited field of possibilities. Since for the most part the commander-in-chief has only to keep these objects steadily in view, therefore the part of the strategy in which he moves is also that which is particularly subject to this difficulty. Theory, therefore, especially when it comprehends the highest services, will stop much sooner in strategy than in tactics, at the simple consideration of things, and consent itself to assist the commander to that insight into things which, blended with his whole thought, makes his course easier and surer, never forces him into opposition with himself in order to obey an objective truth. End of Book 2, Chapter 2. Recording by Timothy Ferguson, Gold Coast, Australia. Book 2, Chapters 3 and 4 of On War. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Timothy Ferguson. On War by Karl von Clausewitz. Translated by Colonel J. J. Graham. Book 2, Chapter 3. Art or Science of War. 1. Usage still unsettled. Power and knowledge, science when mere knowing, art when doing, is the object. The choice between these terms seems to be still unsettled, and no one seems to know rightly on what grounds it should be decided, and yet the thing is simple. We have already said elsewhere that knowing is something different from doing. The two are so different that they should not easily be mistaken, the one for the other. The doing cannot properly stand in any book, and therefore also art should never be the title of a book. But because we have once accustomed ourselves to combine in conception, under the name of theory of art, or simply art, the branches of knowledge, which may be separately pure sciences, necessary for the practice of an art, therefore it is consistent to continue this ground of distinction, and to call everything art when the object is to carry out the doing, being able, as for example, art of building. Science, when merely knowledge is the object, as science of mathematics, of astronomy. That in every art certain complete sciences may be included is intelligible of itself, and should not perplex us. But still it is worth observing that there is also no science without a mixture of art. In mathematics, for instance, the use of figures and of algebra is an art, but this is only one amongst many instances. The reason is that however plain and palpable the difference is between knowledge and power in the composite results of human knowledge, yet it is difficult to trace out their line of separation in man himself. 2. Difficulty of separating perception from judgment, art of war. All thinking is indeed art. Where the logician draws the line, where the premises stop which are the result of cognition, where judgment begins, there art begins. But more than this even, the perception of the mind is judgment again, and, consequently, art, and at last even the perception by the senses as well. In a word, if it is impossible to imagine a human being possessing merely the faculty of cognition, devoid of judgment, or the reverse, so also art and science can never be completely separated from each other. The more these subtle elements of light embody themselves in the outward forms of the world, so much the more separate appear their domains. And now once more, where the object is the creation and production, there is the province of art. Where the object is investigation and knowledge, science holds sway. After all this, it results of itself that it is more fitting to say art of war than science of war. So much for this, because we cannot do without these conceptions. But now we come forward with the assertion that war is neither an art nor a science in the real signification, and that it is just a setting out from the starting point of ideas which has led to a wrong direction being taken, which has caused war to be put on par with other arts and sciences, and has led to a number of erroneous analogies. This has indeed been felt before now, and on that it was maintained that war is a handicraft, but here there was more loss than gained by that, for a handicraft is only an inferior art, and as such is also subject to definite and rigid laws. In reality, the art of war did go on for some time in the spirit of a handicraft. We allude to the times of the condottieri. But then it received that direction not from intrinsic, but from external causes, and military history shows how little it was at that time in accordance with the nature of the thing. 3. War is part of the intercourse of the human race. We say, therefore, war belongs not to the province of arts and sciences, but to the province of social life. It is a conflict of great interests, which is settled by bloodshed, and only in that is it different from others. It would be better, instead of comparing it with any art, to liken it to business competition, which is also a conflict of human interests and activities, and it is still more like state policy, which again, on its part, may be looked upon as a kind of business competition on a great scale. Besides, state policy is the womb in which war is developed, in which its outlines lie hidden in a rudimentary state, like the qualities of living creatures in their germs. 4. Difference. The essential difference consists in this, that war is no activity of the will, which exerts itself upon inanimate matter, like the mechanical arts, or upon a living but still passive and yielding subject, like the human mind and the human feelings in the ideal arts, but against a living and reacting force. How little the categories of arts and sciences are applicable to such an activity strikes us at once, and we can understand at the same time how the constant seeking and striving after laws, like those which may be developed out of the dead material world, could not but lead to constant errors. And yet it is just the mechanical arts that some people would imitate in the art of war. The imitation of the ideal arts was quite out of the question, because these themselves dispense too much with laws and rules, and those hitherto tried, always acknowledged as insufficient and one-sided, are perpetually undermined and washed away by the current of opinions, feelings, and customs. Whether such a conflict of the living, as takes place and is settled in war, is subject to general laws, and whether these are capable of indicating a useful line of action, will be partly investigated in this book. But so much is evident in itself, that this, like every other subject which does not surpass our powers of understanding, may be lighted up and be made more or less plain in its inner relations by an inquiring mind, and that alone is sufficient to realize the idea of a theory. Chapter 4. Methodicism. In order to explain ourselves clearly as to the conception of method, and method of action, which plays such an important part in war, we must be allowed to cast a hasty glance at the logical hierarchy through which, as through regularly constituted official functionaries, the world of action is governed. Law, in the widest sense, strictly applying to perception as well as action, has plainly something subjective and arbitrary in its literal meaning, and expresses just that on which we and those things external to us are dependent. As a subject of cognition, law is the relation of things and their effects to one another. As a subject of the will, it is a motive of action, and it is then equivalent to command or prohibition. Principle is likewise a law for action, except that it has no formal, definite meaning, but it is only the spirit and sense of law in order to leave the judgment more freedom of application when the diversity of the real world cannot be laid hold of under the definite form of law. As the judgment must of itself suggest the cases in which the principle is not applicable, the latter therefore becomes, in that way, a real aid or guiding star for the person acting. Principle is objective when it is the result of an objective truth, and consequently of equal value for all men. It is subjective, and then generally called maxim, if there are subjective relations in it, and if it therefore has a certain value only for the person himself who makes it. Rule is frequently taken in the sense of law, and then means the same as principle, for we say no rule without exceptions, but we do not say no law without exceptions, a sign that with rule we retain to ourselves more freedom of application. In another meaning, rule is the means used of discerning a recondite truth in a particular sign lying close at hand, in order to attach to this particular sign the law of action directed upon the whole truth. Of this kind are all the rules of games of play, all the bridge processes in mathematics and such. Directions and instructions are determinations of action which have an influence upon a number of minor circumstances too numerous and unimportant for general laws. Lastly, method mode of acting is an always recurring proceeding selected out of several possible ones, and methodism, is that which is determined by methods instead of by general principles or particular prescriptions. By this, the cases which are placed under such methods must necessarily be supposed alike in their essential parts. As they cannot all be this, then the point is that at least as many as possible should be. In other words, that method should be calculated on the most probable cases. Methodicism is therefore not founded on determined particular premises, but on the average probability of cases, one with another, and its ultimate tendency is to set up an average truth, the constant and uniform application of which soon acquires something of the nature of a mechanical appliance, which in the end does that which is right almost unwittingly. The conception of law in relation to perception is not necessary for the conduct of war, because the complex phenomena of war are not so regular, and the regular are not so complex, that we should gain anything more by this conception than by the simple truth, and where a simple conception and language is sufficient, to resort to the complex becomes affected and pedantic. The conception of law in relation to action cannot be used in the theory of the conduct of war, because owing to the variableness and diversity of the phenomena, there is in it no determination of such a general nature as to deserve the name of law. But principles, rules, prescriptions, and methods are conceptions indispensable to a theory of the conduct of war, insofar as that theory leads to positive doctrines, because in doctrines the truth can only crystallize itself in such forms. As tactics is the branch of the conduct of war in which theory can attain the nearest positive doctrine, therefore these conceptions will appear in it most frequently. Not to use cavalry against unbroken infantry, except in some case of special emergency, only to use firearms within effective range in the combat, to spare the forces as much as possible for the final struggle, these are tactical principles. None of them can be applied absolutely in every case, but they must be present to the mind of the chief, in order that the benefit of the truth contained in them may not be lost in cases where that truth can be of advantage. If from the unusual cooking by an enemy's camp his movement is inferred, if the intentional exposure of troops in a combat indicates a false attack, then this way of discerning the truth is called a rule, because from a single visible circumstance that conclusion is drawn which corresponds with the same. If it is a rule to attack the enemy with renewed vigour as soon as he begins to limber up his artillery in the combat, then on this particular fact depends a course of action which is aimed at the general situation of the enemy, as inferred from the above fact, namely, that he is about to give up the fight, that he is commencing to draw off his troops, and is neither capable of making a serious stand while thus drawing off, nor of making his retreat gradually in good order. Regulations and methods bring preparatory theories into the conduct of war, insofar as disciplined troops are inoculated with them as active principles. The whole body of instructions for formations, drill, and field service are regulations and methods. In the drill instructions, the first predominate, in the field service instructions, the latter. To these things the real conduct of war attaches itself. It takes them over, therefore, as given modes of proceeding, and as such they must appear in the theory of the conduct of war. But for those activities retaining freedom in the employment of these forces, there cannot be regulations, that is, definite instructions, because they would do away with freedom of action. Methods, on the other hand, is a general way of executing duties as they arise, calculated, as we have said, on an average of probability, or as a dominating influence of principles and rules carried through to application, may certainly appear in the theory of the conduct of war, provided only they are not represented as something different from what they are, not as the absolute and necessary modes of action, systems, but as the best of general forms, which may be used as shorter ways in place of a particular disposition for the occasion at discretion. But the frequent application of methods will be seen to be most essential and unavoidable in the conduct of war if we reflect how much action proceeds on mere conjecture or in complete uncertainty, because one side is prevented from learning all the circumstances which influence the dispositions of the other, or because, even if these circumstances which influence the decisions of the one were really known, there is not, owing to their extent and the dispositions they would entail, sufficient time for the other to carry out all the necessary counteracting measures, that therefore measures in war must always be calculated on a certain number of possibilities. If we reflect how numberless are the trifling things belonging to any single event, and which therefore should be taken into account along with it, and that therefore there is no other means to suppose the one counteracted by the other, and to base our arrangements only upon what is of a general nature and probable, if we reflect lastly, owing to the increasing numbers of officers as we descend the scale of rank, less must be left to the true discernment and ripe judgment of individuals, the lower the sphere of action, and that when we reach those ranks where we can look for no other notions but those which the regulations of the service and experience afford, we must help them with the methodic forms bordering on those regulations. This will serve both as a support to their judgment and a barrier against those extravagant and erroneous views which are so especially to be dreaded in a sphere where experience is so costly. Besides this absolute need of method in action, we must also acknowledge that it has a positive advantage, which is that through the constant repetition of a formal exercise, a readiness, precision, and firmness is attained in the movement of troops, which diminishes the natural friction and makes the machine move easier. Method will, therefore, be the more generally used, become the more indispensable, the farther down the scale of rank the position of the active agent, and on the other hand, its use will diminish upwards, until in the highest position it quite disappears. For this reason, it is more in its place in tactics than in strategy. War in its highest aspects consists not of an infinite number of little events, the diversities in which compensate each other, and which therefore, by a better or worse method, are better or worse governed, but of separate great decisive events which must be dealt with separately. It is not like a field of stalks which, without any regard to the particular form of each stalk, will be mowed better or worse according as the mowing instrument is good or bad, but rather as a group of large trees, to which the axe must be laid with judgment, according to the particular form and inclination of each separate trunk. How high up in military activity the admissibility of method in action reaches naturally determines itself not according to actual rank, but according to things, and it affects the highest positions in a less degree only because these positions have the most comprehensive subjects of activity. A constant order of battle, a constant formation of advance guards and outposts, are methods by which a general ties not only his subordinates' hands, but also his own in certain cases. Certainly they may have been devised by himself, and may be applied by him according to circumstances, but they may also be a subject of theory insofar as they are based on the general properties of troops and weapons. On the other hand, any method by which definite plans for wars or campaigns are to be given out, all ready-made as if from a machine, are absolutely worthless. As long as there exists no theory which can be sustained, that is, no enlightened treatise on the conduct of war, method in action cannot but encroach beyond its proper limits in high places, for men employed in these spheres of activity have not always had the opportunity of educating themselves, through study and through contact with the higher interests. In the impracticable and inconsistent disquisitions of theorists and critics, they cannot find their way. Their sound common sense rejects them, and as they bring with them no knowledge but that derived from experience, therefore, in those cases which admit of and require a free individual treatment, they regularly make use of the means which experience gives them, that is, in an imitation of the particular methods practised by great generals, by which a method of action always arises of itself. If we see Frederick the Great's generals always making their appearance in the so-called oblique order of battle, the generals of the French Revolution always using turning movements with a long extended line of battle, and Bonaparte's lieutenants rushing to the attack with the bloody energy of concentrated masses, then we recognize in the recurrence of the mode of proceeding evidently an adopted method, and see therefore that method of action can reach up to regions bordering on the highest. Should an improved theory facilitate the study of the conduct of war, form the mind and the judgment of men who are rising to the highest commands, then also method in action will no longer reach so far, and so much of it as is to be considered indispensable will then at least be formed from theory itself, and not take place out of mere imitation. However preeminently a great commander does things, there is always something subjective in the way he does them, and if he has a certain manner, a large share of his individuality is contained in it, which does not always accord with the individuality of the person who copies his manner. At the same time, it would neither be possible nor right to banish subjective methodicism or manner completely from the conduct of war. It is rather to be regarded as a manifestation of that influence which the general character of a war has upon its separate events, and to which satisfaction can only be done, in that way, if theory is not able to foresee this general character and include it in its considerations. What is more natural than that the War of the French Revolution had its own way of doing things, and what theory could ever have included that peculiar method? The evil is only that such a manner, originating in a special case, easily outlives itself, because it continues whilst circumstances imperceptibly change. This is what theory should prevent by lucid and rational criticism. When in the year 1806 the Prussian generals, Prince Louis at Saalfeld, Torrensen on the Dornberg near Jena, Growoed before and Ruchel behind Kapellendorf, all threw themselves into the open jaws of destruction in the oblique order of Frederick the Great, and managed to ruin Hohenlohe's army in a way that no army was ever ruined, even on the field of battle. All this was done through a manner which had outlived its day, together with the most downright stupidity to which methodicism ever led. End of Book 2, Chapters 3 and 4. Recording by Timothy Ferguson, Gold Coast, Australia. Book 2, Chapter 5 of On War. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Timothy Ferguson. On War by Karl von Clausewitz, translated by Colonel J. J. Graham. Chapter 5. Criticism. The influence of theoretical principles upon real life is produced more through criticism than through doctrine, for as criticism is an application of abstract truth to real events, therefore it not only brings truth of this description nearer to life, but also accustoms the understanding more to such truths by the constant repetition of their application. We therefore think it necessary to fix the point of view for criticism next to that for theory. From the simple narration of any historical occurrence which places events in chronological order, or at most only touches on their more immediate causes, we separate the critical. In this critical, three different operations of the mind may be observed. First, the historical investigation and determining of doubtful facts. This is properly historical research, and has nothing in common with theory. Secondly, the tracing of effects to causes. This is the real critical inquiry. It is indispensable to theory, for everything in which theory is to be established, supported, or even merely explained by experience can only be settled in this way. Thirdly, the testing of the means employed. This is criticism, properly speaking, in which praise and censure is contained. This is where theory helps history, or rather, the teaching to be derived from it. In these two last, strictly critical parts of historical study, all depends on tracing things to their primary elements, that is to say, up to undoubted truths, and not, as is so often done, resting halfway, that is, on some arbitrary assumption or supposition. As respects the tracing of effect to cause, that is often attended with the insufferable difficulty that the real causes are not known. In none of the relations of life does this so frequently happen as in war, where events are seldom fully known and still less motives, as the latter have been, perhaps purposely, concealed by the chief actor, or have been of such a transient and accidental character that they have been lost for history. For this reason, critical narration must, generally, proceed hand in hand with historical investigation. And still, such a want of connection between cause and effect will often present itself that it does not seem justifiable to consider effects as the necessary results of known causes. Here therefore must occur, that is, historical results which cannot be made use of for teaching. All that theory can demand is that the investigation should be rigidly conducted up to that point, and there leave off without drawing conclusions. A real evil springs up only if the known is made perforce to suffice as an explanation of effects, and thus a false importance is ascribed to it. Besides this difficulty, critical inquiry also meets with another great and intrinsic one, which is that the progress of events in war seldom proceeds from one simple cause, but from several in common, and that it therefore is not sufficient to follow up a series of events to their origin in a candid and impartial spirit, but that it is then also necessary to apportion to each contributing cause its due weight. This leads therefore to a closer investigation of their nature, and thus a critical investigation may lead into what is the proper field of theory. The critical consideration, that is, the testing of the means, leads to the question, which are the effects peculiar to the means applied, and whether these effects were comprehended in the plans of the person directing. The effects peculiar to the means lead to the investigation of their nature, and thus again into the field of theory. We have already seen that in criticism all depends upon attaining to positive truth, therefore that we must not stop at arbitrary propositions which are not allowed by others, and to which other, perhaps equally arbitrary assertions may again be opposed, so that there is no end to pros and cons. The whole is without result, and therefore without instruction. We have seen that both the search for causes and the examination of means lead into the field of theory, that is, into the field of universal truth, which does not proceed solely from the case immediately under examination. If there is a theory which can be used, then the critical consideration will appeal to the proofs there afforded, and the examination may there stop. But where no such theoretical truth is to be found, the inquiry must be pushed up to the original elements. If this necessity occurs often, it must lead the historian, according to a common expression, into a labyrinth of details. He then has his hands full, and it is impossible for him to stop to give the requisite attention everywhere. The consequence is that in order to set bounds to his investigation, he adopts some arbitrary assumptions which, if they do not appear so to him, do so to others, as they are not evident in themselves or capable of proof. A sound theory is therefore an essential foundation for criticism, and it is impossible for it, without the assistance of a sensible theory, to attain to that point at which it commences chiefly to be instructive, that is, where it becomes demonstration both convincing and sans replique. But it would be a visionary hope to believe in the possibility of a theory applicable to every abstract truth, leaving nothing for criticism to do but place the case under its appropriate law. It would be ridiculous pedantry to lay down as a rule for criticism that it must always halt and turn round on reaching the boundaries of sacred theory. The same spirit of analytical inquiry, which is the origin of theory, must also guide the critic in his work, and it can and must therefore happen that he strays beyond the boundaries of the province of theory and elucidates those points with which he is more particularly concerned. It is more likely, on the contrary, that criticism would completely fail in its object if it degenerated into a mechanical application of theory. All positive results of theoretical inquiry, all principles, rules, and methods, are the more wanting in generality and positive truth, the more they become positive doctrine. They exist to offer themselves for use as required, and it must always be left for judgment to decide whether they are suitable or not. Such results of theory must never be used in criticism as rules or norms for a standard, but in the same way as the person acting should use them, that is, merely as aids to judgment. If it is an acknowledged principle in tactics that in the usual order of battle cavalry should be placed behind infantry, not in line with it, still it would be folly on this account to condemn every deviation from this principle. Criticism must investigate the grounds of the deviation, and it is only in case these are insufficient that it has a right to appeal to the principles laid down in theory. If it is further established in theory that a divided attack diminishes the probability of success, still it would be just as unreasonable, whenever there is a divided attack and an unsuccessful issue, to regard the latter as the result of the former without further investigation into the connection between the two, as where a divided attack is successful, to infer from it the fallacy of the theoretical principle. The spirit of investigation which belongs to criticism cannot allow either. Criticism, therefore, supports itself chiefly on the results of the analytical investigation of theory. What has been made out and determined by theory does not require to be demonstrated over again by criticism, and it is so determined by theory that criticism may find it readily demonstrated. This office of criticism, of examining the effect produced by certain causes and whether a means applied has answered its object, will be easy enough if cause and effect, means and end are all near together. If an army is surprised and therefore cannot make a regular and intelligent use of its powers and resources, then the effect of the surprise is not doubtful. If theory has determined that in a battle the convergent form of attack is calculated to produce greater but less certain results, then the question is whether he who employs that convergent form had in view chiefly that greatness of result as his object. If so, the proper means were chosen. But if by this form he intended to make the result more certain, and that expectation was founded not on some exceptional circumstances in this case, but on the general nature of the convergent form, as has happened 100 times, then he mistook the nature of the means and committed an error. Here the work of military investigation and criticism is easy, and it will always be so when confined to the immediate effects and objects. This can be done quite at option if we abstract the connection of the parts with the whole and only look at the things in that relation. But in war, as generally in the world, there is a connection between everything which belongs to a whole, and therefore, however small a cause may be in itself, its effects reach to the end of the act of warfare and modify or influence the final result in some degree, let that degree be ever so small. In the same manner, every means must be felt up to the ultimate object. We can therefore trace the effects of a cause as long as events are worth noticing, and in the same way we must not stop at the testing of a means for the immediate object, but test also this object as a means to a higher one, and thus ascend the series of facts in succession until we come to one so absolutely necessary in its nature as to require no examinational proof. In many cases, particularly in what concerns great and decisive measures, the investigation must be carried to the final aim, to that which leads immediately to peace. It is evident that in thus ascending at every new station which we reach, a new point of view for the judgment is attained, so that the same means which appeared advisable at one station, when looked at from the next above it, may have to be rejected. The search for the causes of events and the comparison of means with ends must always go hand in hand in the critical review of an act, for the investigation of causes leads us first to the discovery of those things which are worth examining. This following of the clue up and down is attended with considerable difficulty, for the farther from an event the cause lies, which we are looking for, the greater must be the number of other causes, which must at the same time be kept in view and allowed for in reference to the share which they have in the course of events, and then eliminated, because the higher the importance of a fact, the greater will be the number of separate forces and circumstances by which it is conditioned. If we have unravelled the causes of a battle being lost, we have certainly also ascertained a part of the causes of the consequences which this defeat has upon the whole war, but only a part, because the effects of other causes, more or less according to circumstances, will flow into the final result. The same multiplicity of circumstances is presented also in the examination of the means the higher our point of view. For the higher the object is situated, the greater must be the number of means employed to reach it. The ultimate object of war is the object aimed at by all the armies simultaneously, and it is therefore necessary that the consideration should embrace all that each has done or could have done. It is obvious that this may sometimes lead to a wide field of inquiry, in which it is easy to wander and lose the way, and in which this difficulty prevails, that a number of assumptions or suppositions must be made about a variety of things which do not actually appear, but which in all probability did take place, and therefore cannot possibly be left out of consideration. When Bonaparte, in 1797, at the head of the army of Italy, advanced from the Tagliamento against the Archduke Charles, he did so with a view to force that general to a decisive action before the reinforcements, expected from the Rhine, had reached him. If we look only at the immediate object, the means were well chosen and justified by the result, for the Archduke was so inferior in numbers that he only made a show of resistance on the Tagliamento, and when he saw his adversary so strong and resolute, yielded ground and left open the passages of the Norican Alps. Now, to what use could Bonaparte turn this fortunate event? To penetrate into the heart of the Austrian Empire itself, to facilitate the advance of the Rhine armies under Miro and Hoch, and open communication with them. This was the view taken by Bonaparte, and from this point of view he was right. But now, if criticism places itself at a higher point of view, namely that of the French Directory, which body could see and know that the armies of the Rhine could not commence the campaign for 6 weeks, then the advance of Bonaparte over the Norican Alps can only be regarded as an extremely hazardous measure, for if the Austrians had drawn largely on their Rhine armies to reinforce their army in Styria, so as to enable the Archduke to fall upon the army of Italy, not only would that army have been routed, but the whole campaign lost. This consideration, which attracted the serious attention of Bonaparte at Villach, no doubt induced him to sign the Armistice of Leoben with so much readiness. If criticism takes a still higher position, and if it knows that the Austrians had no reserves between the army of the Archduke Charles and Vienna, then we see that Vienna became threatened by the advance of the army of Italy. Supposing that Bonaparte knew that the capital was thus uncovered, and knew that he still retained the same superiority in numbers over the Archduke as he had in Styria, then his advance against the heart of the Austrian states was no longer without purpose, and its value depended on the value which the Austrians might place on preserving their capital. If that was so great that, rather than lose it, they would accept the conditions of peace which Bonaparte was ready to offer them, it became an object of the first importance to threaten Vienna. If Bonaparte had any reason to know this, then criticism may stop there. But if this point was only problematical, then criticism must take a still higher position and ask what would have followed if the Austrians had resolved to abandon Vienna and retire further into the vast dominions still left to them. But it is easy to see that this question cannot be answered without bringing into the consideration the probable movements of the Rhine armies on both sides. Through the decided superiority of numbers on the side of the French, 130,000 to 80,000, there could be little doubt of the result. But then next arises the question, what use would the Directory make of a victory? Whether they would follow up their success to the opposite frontiers of the Austrian monarchy, therefore to the complete breaking up or overthrow of that power, or whether they would be satisfied with the conquest of a considerable portion to serve as a security for peace. The probable result in each case must be estimated in order to come to a conclusion as to the probable determination of the Directory. Supposing the result of these considerations to be that the French forces were much too weak for the complete subjugation of the Austrian monarchy, so that the attempt might completely reverse the respective positions of the contending armies, and that even the conquest and occupation of a considerable district of country would place the French army in strategic relations to which they were not equal, then that result must naturally influence the estimate of the position of the army of Italy and compel it to lower its expectations. And this it was which no doubt influenced Bonaparte, although fully aware of the helpless condition of the Archduke, still to sign the Peace of Campo Formio, which imposed no greater sacrifices on the Austrians than the loss of provinces which, even if the campaign took the most favourable turn for them, they could not have reconquered. But the French could not have reckoned on even the moderate treaty of Campo Formio, and therefore it could not have been their object in making their bold advance, if two considerations had not presented themselves to their view, the first of which consisted in the question what degree of value the Austrians would attach to each of the above-mentioned results, whether, notwithstanding the probability of a satisfactory result in either of these cases, would it be worthwhile to make the sacrifices inseparable from a continuance of the war, when they could be spared those sacrifices by a peace on terms not too humiliating. The second consideration is the question whether the Austrian government, instead of seriously weighing the possible results of a resistance pushed to extremities, would not prove completely disheartened by the impression of their present reverses. The consideration which forms the subject of the first is no idle piece of subtle argument, but a consideration of such decidedly practical importance that it comes up whenever the plan of pushing war to its utmost extremity is mooted, and, by its weight, in most cases, restrains the execution of such plans. The second consideration is of equal importance, for we do not make war with an abstraction, but with a reality, which we must always keep in view, and we may be sure that it was not overlooked by the bold Bonaparte, that is, that he was keenly alive to the terror which the appearance of his sword inspired. It was reliance on that which led him to Moscow. There it led him into a scrape. The terror of him had been weakened by the gigantic struggles in which he had been engaged. In the year 797 it was still fresh, and the secret of a resistance pushed to extremities had not been discovered. Nevertheless, even in 1797, his boldness might have led to a negative result if, as already said, he had not, with a sort of presentiment, avoided it by signing the moderate peace of Campo Formio. We must now bring these considerations to a close. They will suffice to show the wide sphere, the diversity and embarrassing nature of the subjects embraced in a critical examination carried to the fullest extent. That is, to those measures of a great and decisive class which must necessarily be included. It follows from them that, besides a theoretical acquaintance with the subject, natural talent must also have a great influence on the value of critical examinations, for it rests chiefly with the latter to throw the requisite light on the interrelations of things, and to distinguish from amongst the endless connections of events those which are really essential. But talent is also called into requisition in another way. Critical examination is not merely the appreciation of those means which have been actually employed, but also of all possible means, which therefore must be suggested in the first place. That is, must be discovered, and the use of any particular means is not fairly open to censure until a better is pointed out. Now, however small the number of possible combinations may be in most cases, still it must be admitted that to point out those which have not been used is not a mere analysis of actual things, but a spontaneous creation which cannot be prescribed, and depends on the fertility of genius. We are far from seeing a field for great genius in a case which admits only of the application of a few simple combinations, and we think it exceedingly ridiculous to hold up, as is often done, the turning of a position as an invention showing the highest genius. Still, nevertheless, this creative self-activity on the part of the critic is necessary, and it is one of those points which essentially determine the value of critical examination. When Bonaparte, on the 30th of July, 1796, determined to raise the siege of Mantua, in order to march with his whole force against the enemy, advancing in separate columns to the relief of the place, and to beat them in detail, this appeared the surest way to the attainment of brilliant victories. These victories actually followed, and were afterwards again repeated on a still more brilliant scale, on the attempt to relieve the fortress being again renewed. We hear only one opinion on these achievements, that of unmixed admiration. At the same time, Bonaparte could not have adopted this course on the 30th of July without quite giving up on the idea of the siege of Mantua, because it was impossible to save the siege train, and it could not be replaced by another in this campaign. In fact, the siege was converted into a blockade, and the town, which, if the siege had continued, must have very shortly fallen, held out for 6 months in spite of Bonaparte's victories in the open field. Criticism has generally regarded this as an evil that was unavoidable, because critics have not been able to suggest any better course. Resistance to a relieving army within lines of circumvallation had fallen into such disrepute and contempt that it appears to have entirely escaped consideration as a means, and yet in the reign of Louis XIV that measure was so often used with success that we can only attribute to the force of fashion the fact that 100 years later it never occurred to anyone even to propose such a measure. If the practicability of such a plan had ever been entertained for a moment, a closer consideration of circumstances would have shown that 40,000 of the best infantry in the world under Bonaparte, behind strong lines of circumvallation around Mantua, had so little to fear from the 50,000 men coming to relief under Wurmser that it was very unlikely that any attempt even would have been made upon their lines. We shall not seek here to establish this point, but we believe enough has been said to show that this means was one which had a right to a share of consideration. Whether Bonaparte himself ever thought of such a plan, we leave undecided. Neither in his memoirs nor in any other sources is there any trace to be found of his having done so. In no critical works has it been touched upon, the measure being one which the mind had lost sight of. The merit of resuscitating the idea of this means is not great, for it suggests itself at once to anyone who breaks loose from the trammels of fashion. Still, it is necessary that it should suggest itself for us to bring it into consideration, and compare it with the means which Bonaparte employed. Whatever may be the result of the comparison, it is one which should not be omitted by criticism. When Bonaparte, in February 1814, after gaining the battles at Etoges, Champaubay, and Montmiral, left Blucher's army and, turning upon Schwarzenberg, beat his troops at Montereau and Mormant, everyone was filled with admiration, because Bonaparte, by thus throwing his concentrated force first upon one opponent, then upon another, made a brilliant use of the mistakes which his adversaries had committed in dividing their forces. If these brilliant strokes in different directions failed to save him, it was generally considered to be no fault of his, at least. No one has yet asked the question, what would have been the result if, instead of turning from Blucher upon Schwarzenberg, he had tried another blow at Blucher and pursued him to the Rhine? We are convinced that it would have completely changed the course of the campaign, and that the army of the Allies, instead of marching to Paris, would have retired behind the Rhine. We do not ask others to share our conviction, but no one who understands the thing will doubt, at the mere mention of this alternative course, that it is one which should not be overlooked in criticism. In this case, the means of comparison lie much more on the surface than in the foregoing, but they have been equally overlooked, because one-sided views have prevailed, and there has been no freedom of judgment. From the necessity of pointing out a better means, which might have been used in place of those which are condemned, has arisen the form of criticism almost exclusively in use, which contents itself with pointing out the better means without demonstrating in what the superiority consists. The consequence is that some are not convinced, that others start up and do the same thing, and that thus discussion arises which is without any fixed basis for the argument. Military literature abounds with matter of this sort. The demonstration we require is always necessary when the superiority of means propounded is not so evident as to leave no room for doubt, and consists in examination of each of the means on its own merits, and then of its comparison with the object desired. When once the thing is traced back to a simple truth, controversy must cease, or at all events a new result is obtained, whilst by the other plan the pros and cons go on forever consuming each other. Should we, for example, not rest content with assertion, in the case before mentioned, and wish to prove that the persistent pursuit of Blucher would have been more advantageous than turning upon Schwarzenberg, we should support the arguments on the following simple truths. 1. In general, it is more advantageous to continue our blows in one and the same direction, because there is a loss of time in striking in different directions, and at a point where the moral power is already shaken by considerable losses, there is the more reason to expect fresh successes. Therefore, in that way, no part of the preponderance already gained is left idle. 2. Because Blucher, although weaker than Schwarzenberg, was, on account of his enterprising spirit, the more important adversary. In him, therefore, lay the centre of attraction, which drew the others along in the same direction. 3. Because the losses which Blucher had sustained almost amounted to a defeat, which gave Bonaparte such a preponderance over him as to make his retreat to the Rhine almost certain, and at the same time no reserves of any consequence awaited him there. 4. Because there was no other result which would be so terrific in its aspects, which would appear to the imagination in such gigantic proportions, an immense advantage in dealing with a staff so weak and irresolute as that of Schwarzenberg notoriously was at this time. What had happened to the Crown Prince of Württemberg at Montereau, and to Count Wittgenstein at Mormant, Prince Schwarzenberg must have known well enough, but all the untoward events on Blucher's distant and separate line from the Marne to the Rhine would only reach him by the avalanche of rumour. The desperate movements which Bonaparte made upon Vitry at the end of March, to see what the Allies would do if he threatened to turn them strategically, were evidently done on the principle of working on their fears. But it was done under far different circumstances, in consequence of his defeat at Laon and Arcus, and because Blucher, with 100,000 men, was then in communication with Schwarzenberg. There are people, no doubt, who will not be convinced by these arguments, but at all events they cannot retort by saying that, whilst Bonaparte threatened Schwarzenberg's base by advancing to the Rhine, Schwarzenberg at the same time threatened Bonaparte's communications with Paris, because we have shown by the reasons above given that Schwarzenberg would never have thought of marching on Paris. With respect to the example quoted by us from the campaign of 1796, we should say, Bonaparte looked upon the plan he adopted as the surest means of beating the Austrians, but admitting that it was so, still the object to be attained was only an empty victory, which could have hardly any sensible influence on the fall of Mantua. The way which we should have chosen would, in our opinion, have been much more certain to prevent the relief of Mantua, but even if we place ourselves in the position of the French general, and assume that it was not so, and look upon the certainty of success to having been less, the question then amounts to a choice between a more certain but less useful, and therefore less important, victory on the one hand, and a somewhat less probable but far more decisive and important victory on the other hand. Presented in this form, boldness must have declared for the second solution, which is the reverse of what took place, when the thing was only superficially viewed. Bonaparte was certainly anything but deficient in boldness, and we may be sure that he did not see the whole case and its consequences as fully and clearly as we can at the present time. Naturally, the critic, in treating of the means, must often appeal to military history, as experience is of more value in the art of war than all philosophical truth. But this exemplification from history is subject to certain conditions, of which we shall treat in a special chapter, and unfortunately these conditions are so seldom regarded that reference to history generally only serves to increase the confusion of ideas. We have still a most important subject to consider, which is how far criticism in passing judgments on particular events is permitted, or in duty bound, to make use of its wider view of things, and therefore also of that which is shown by results, or when and where it should leave out sight of these things in order to place itself, as far as possible, in the exact position of the chief actor. If criticism dispenses praise or censure, it should seek to place itself, as nearly as possible, at the same point of view as the person acting, that is to say, to collect all he knew and all the motives on which he acted, and, on the other hand, to leave out of the consideration all that the person acting could not or did not know, and above all, the result. But this is only an object to aim at, which can never be reached, because the state of circumstances from which an event proceeded can never be placed before the eye of the critic, exactly as it lay before the eye of the person acting. A number of inferior circumstances, which must have influenced the result, are completely lost to sight, and many a subjective motive has never come to light. The latter can only be learnt from the memoirs of the chief actor, or from his intimate friends, and in such things of this kind are often treated of in a very desultory manner, or purposely misrepresented. Criticism must, therefore, always forego much which was present in the minds of those whose acts are criticised. On the other hand, it is much more difficult to leave out of sight that which criticism knows in excess. This is only easy as regards accidental circumstances, that is, circumstances which have been mixed up, but are in no way necessarily related. But it is very difficult, and in fact can never be completely done with regard to things really essential. Let us take first the result. If it has not proceeded from accidental circumstances, it is almost impossible that the knowledge of it should not have an effect on the judgment passed on events which have preceded it. For we see these things in the light of the result, and it is to a certain extent by it that we first become acquainted with them and appreciate them. Military history with all its events is a source of instruction for criticism itself, and it is only natural that criticism should throw that light on things which it has itself obtained from the consideration of the whole. If therefore it might wish in some cases to leave the result out of the consideration, it would be impossible to do so completely. But it is not only in relation to the result, that is, what takes place at the last, that this embarrassment arises. The same occurs in relation to preceding events, therefore with the data which furnish the motives to action. Criticism has before it, in most cases, more information on this point than the principal in the transaction. Now, it may seem easy to dismiss from the consideration everything of this nature, but it is not so easy as we may think. The knowledge of preceding and concurrent events is founded not only on certain information, but on a number of conjectures and suppositions. Indeed, there is hardly any of the information respecting things not purely accidental, which has not been preceded by suppositions or conjectures destined to take the place of certain information, in case such should never be supplied. Now, it is conceivable that criticism in after times, which has before it as facts all the preceding and concurrent circumstances, should not allow itself to be thereby influenced, when it asks itself the question, what portion of the circumstances, which at the moment of action were unknown, would it have held to be probable? We maintain that in this case, as in the case of the results, and for the same reason, it is impossible to disregard all these things completely. If therefore the critic wishes to bestow praise or blame upon a single act, he can only succeed to a certain degree by placing himself in the position of the person whose act he has under review. In many cases he can do so sufficiently near for any practical purpose, but in many instances it is the very reverse, and this fact should never be overlooked. But it is neither necessary nor desirable that criticism should completely identify itself with the person acting. In war, as in all matters of skill, there is a certain natural aptitude required which is called talent. This may be great or small. In the first case, it may easily be superior to that of the critic, for what critic can pretend to the skill of a Frederick or a Bonaparte? Therefore, if criticism is not to abstain altogether from offering an opinion, where eminent talent is concerned, it must be allowed to make use of the advantage which its enlarged horizon affords. Criticism must not, therefore, treat the solution of a problem by a great general like a sum in arithmetic. It is only through the results and through the exact coincidences of events that it can recognize with admiration how much is due to the exercise of genius, and that it first learns the essential combination which the glance of that genius devised. But for every, even the smallest, act of genius, it is necessary that criticism should take a higher point of view, so that, having at command many objective grounds of decision, it may be as little subjective as possible, and that the critic may not take the limited scope of his own mind as a standard. The elevated position of criticism, its praise and blame announced with a full knowledge of all the circumstances, has in itself nothing which hurts our feelings. It only does so if the critic pushes himself forward and speaks in a tone as if all the wisdom which he has obtained by an exhaustive examination of the event under consideration were really his own talent. Palpable as is this deception, it is one which people may easily fall into through vanity, and one which is naturally distasteful to others. It very often happens that although the critic has no such arrogant pretensions, they are imputed to him by the reader, because he has not expressly disclaimed them, and then follows immediately a charge of a want of the power of critical judgment. If, therefore, a critic points out an error made by a Frederick or a Bonaparte, that does not mean that he who makes the criticism would not have committed the same error. He may even be ready to grant that, had he been in the place of one of these great generals, he might have made much greater mistakes. He merely sees this error from the chain of events, and he thinks that it should not have escaped the sagacity of the general. This is, therefore, an opinion formed through the connection of events, and, therefore, through the result. But there is another quite different effect of the result upon the judgment, that is, if it is used quite alone as an example for or against the soundness of a measure. This may be called judgment according to the result. Such a judgment appears at the first sight inadmissible, yet it is not. When Bonaparte marched to Moscow in 1812, all depended upon whether the taking of the capital and the events which preceded the capture would force the Emperor Alexander to make peace, as he had been compelled to do after the Battle of Friedland in 1807, and the Emperor Francis in 1805 and 1809 after Austerlitz and Wagram. For if Bonaparte did not obtain a peace at Moscow, there was no alternative but to return. That is, there was nothing for him but a strategic defeat. We shall leave out the question what he did to get to Moscow, and whether in his advance he did not miss many opportunities of bringing the Emperor Alexander to peace. We shall also exclude all consideration of the disastrous circumstances which attended his retreat, and which perhaps had their origin in the general conduct of the campaign. Still, the question remains the same, for however much more brilliant the course of the campaign up to Moscow might have been, still there was always an uncertainty whether the Emperor Alexander would be intimidated into making peace, and then, even if a retreat did not contain in itself the seeds of such disasters as in fact did occur, still it could never be anything else than a great strategic defeat. If the Emperor Alexander agreed to a peace which was disadvantageous to him, the campaign of 1812 would have ranked with those of Austerlitz, Friedland, and Wagram. But these campaigns also, if they had not led to peace, would in all probability have ended in similar catastrophes. Whatever, therefore, of genius, skill, and energy the conqueror of the world applied to the task, this last question addressed to fate remains always the same. Shall we then discard the campaigns of 1805, 1807, 1809, and say that on account of the campaign of 1812, that they were acts of imprudence, and the results were against the nature of things, and that in 1812 strategic justice at last found vent for itself in opposition to blind chance? That would be an unwarrantable conclusion, a most arbitrary judgment, a case only half proved, because no human eye can trace the thread of necessary connection of events up to the determination of the conquered princes. Still less can we say that the campaign of 1812 merited the same success as the others, and that the reason why it turned out otherwise lies in something unnatural, for we cannot regard the firmness of Alexander as something unpredictable. What can be more natural than to say that in the years 1805, 1807, 1809, Bonaparte judged his opponents correctly, and that in 1812 he erred in that point? On the former occasions, therefore, he was right, in the latter, wrong, and in both cases we judge by the result. All action in war, as we have already said, is directed on the probable, not on certain results. Whatever is wanting in certainty must always be left to fate, or chance, call it what you will. We may demand that what is so left should be as little as possible, but only in relation to the particular case. That is, as little as is possible in this one case, but not that the case in which the least is left to chance is always to be preferred. That would be an enormous error, as follows from all our theoretical views. There are cases in which the greatest daring is the greatest wisdom. Now, in everything which is left to chance by the chief actor, his personal merit, and therefore his responsibility as well, seems to be completely set aside. Nevertheless, we cannot suppress an inward feeling of satisfaction whenever expectation realizes itself, and if it disappoints us, our mind is dissatisfied. And more than this, of right and wrong should not be meant by the judgment which we form from the mere result, or rather that we find there. Nevertheless, it cannot be denied that the satisfaction which our mind experiences at success, the pain caused by failure, proceed from a sort of mysterious feeling. We suppose between that success ascribed to good fortune and the genius of the chief a fine connecting thread, invisible to the mind's eye, and the supposition gives pleasure. What tends to confirm this idea is that our sympathy increases, becomes more decided, if the successes and defeats of the principal actor are often repeated. Thus it becomes intelligible how good luck in war assumes a much nobler nature than good luck at play. In general, when a fortunate warrior does not otherwise lessen our interest in his behalf, we have a pleasure in accompanying him in his career. Criticism, therefore, after having weighed all that comes within the sphere of human reason and conviction, will let the result speak for that part where the deep, mysterious relations are not disclosed in any visible form, and will protect this silent sentence of a higher authority from the noise of crude opinions on the one hand, while on the other it prevents the gross abuse which might be made of this last tribunal. The verdict of the result must, therefore, always bring forth that which human sagacity cannot discover, and it will be chiefly as regards the intellectual powers and operations that it will be called into requisition, partly because they can be estimated with the least certainty, partly because their close connection with the will is favourable to the exercising over it an important influence. When fear or bravery precipitates the decision, there is nothing objective intervening between them for our consideration, and consequently nothing by which sagacity and calculation might have met the probable result. We must now be allowed to make a few observations on the instrument of criticism, that is, the language which it uses, because that is, to a certain extent, connected with the action in war, for the critical examination is nothing more than the deliberation which should precede action in war. We therefore think it very essential that the language used in criticism should have the same character as that which deliberation in war must have, for otherwise it would cease to be practical, and criticism could gain no admittance in actual life. We have said in our observations on the theory of the conduct of war that it should educate the mind of the commander for war, or that its teaching should guide his education. Also that it is not intended to furnish him with positive doctrines and systems which he can use like mental appliances. But if the construction of scientific formulae is never required, or even allowable, in war to aid the decision on the case presented, if truth does not appear there in a systematic shape, if it is not found in an indirect way, but directly by the natural perception of the mind, then it must be the same also in a critical review. It is true, as we have seen, that wherever complete demonstration of the nature of things would be too tedious, criticism must support itself on those truths which theory has established on the point. But just as in war the actor obeys these theoretical truths rather because his mind is imbued with them than because he regards them as objective inflexible laws, so criticism must also make use of them not as an external law or an algebraic formula, of which fresh proof is not required each time they are applied, but it must always throw light on the proof itself, leaving only to theory the more minute and circumstantial proof. Thus it avoids a mysterious, unintelligible phraseology, and makes its progress in plain language, that is, with a clear and always visible chain of ideas. Certainly this cannot always be completely attained, but it must always be the aim in critical expositions. Such expositions must use complicated forms of science as sparingly as possible, and never resort to the construction of scientific aids, as of a truth apparatus of its own, but always be guided by the natural and unbiased impressions of the mind. But this pious endeavour, if we may use that expression, has unfortunately seldom hitherto presided over critical examinations. The most of them have rather been emanations of a species of vanity, a wish to make a display of ideas. The first evil which we constantly stumble upon is a lame, totally inadmissible application of certain one-sided systems as a formal code of laws, but it is never difficult to show the one-sidedness of such systems, and this only requires to be done once to throw discredit forever on critical judgments which are based on them. We have here to deal with a definite subject, and as the number of possible systems, after all, can be but small, therefore also they are themselves the lesser evil. Much greater is the evil which lies in the pompous retinue of technical terms, scientific expressions and metaphors, which these systems carry in their train, and which, like a rabble, like the baggage of an army broken away from its chief, hang about in all directions. Any critic who has not adopted a system, either because he has not found one to please him, or because he has not yet been able to make himself master of one, will at least occasionally make use of a piece of one, as one would use a ruler, to show the blunders committed by a general. The most of them are incapable of reasoning without using, as a help, here and there some shreds of scientific military theory. The smallest of these fragments, consisting in mere scientific words and metaphors, are often nothing more than ornamental flourishes of critical narration. Now it is in the nature of things that all technical and scientific expressions which belong to a system lose their propriety, if they ever had any, as soon as they are distorted and used as general axioms, or as small crystalline talismans, which have more power of demonstration than simple speech. Thus it has come to pass that our theoretical and critical books, instead of being straightforward, intelligible dissertations, in which the author always knows at least what he says, and the reader what he reads, are brimful of these technical terms, which form dark points of interference where the author and the reader part company. But frequently they are something worse, being nothing but hollow shells without any kernel. The author himself has no clear perception of what he means, contents himself with vague ideas, which, if expressed in plain language, would be unsatisfactory even to himself. A third fault in criticism is the misuse of historical examples, and a display of great reading or learning. What the history of the art of war is, we have already said, and we shall further explain our views on examples and on military history in general in special chapters. One fact merely touched upon in a very cursory manner may be used to support the most opposite views, and 3 or 4 such facts of the most heterogeneous description, brought together out of the most distant lands and remote times and heaped up, generally distract and bewilder the judgment and understanding without demonstrating anything. For when exposed to the light, they turn out to be only trumpery rubbish, made use of to show off the author's learning. But what can be gained for practical life by such obscure, partially false, confused, arbitrary conceptions? So little is gained that theory on account of them has always been a true antithesis of practice, and frequently a subject of ridicule to those whose soldierly qualities in the field are above question. But it is impossible that this could have been the case if theory, in simple language, and by natural treatment of those things which constitute the art of making war, had merely sought to establish just so much as admits of being established. If, avoiding all false pretensions and irrelevant display of scientific forms and historical parallels, it had kept close to the subject, and had gone hand in hand with those who must conduct affairs in the field of their own natural genius. End of Book 2, Chapter 5. Recording by Timothy Ferguson, Gold Coast, Australia. Book 2, Chapter 6 of On War. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Timothy Ferguson. On War by Carl von Clausewitz. translated by Colonel J. J. Graham. Chapter 6, on Examples. Examples from history make everything clear and furnish the best description of proof in the empirical sciences. This applies with more force to the art of war than any other. General Scharnhorst, whose handbook is the best ever written on actual war, pronounces historical examples to be of the first importance, and makes an admirable use of them himself. Had he survived the war in which he fell, the fourth part of his revised treatise on artillery would have given a still greater proof of the observing and enlightened spirit in which he sifted matters of experience. But such use of historical examples is rarely made by theoretical writers. The way in which they more commonly make use of them is rather calculated to leave the mind unsatisfied, as well as to offend the understanding. We therefore think it important to bring specially into view the use and abuse of historical examples. Unquestionably, the branches of knowledge which lie at the foundation of the art of war come under the denomination of empirical sciences, for although they are derived in a great measure from the nature of things, still we can only learn this very nature itself for the most part from experience, and besides that, the practical application is modified by so many circumstances that the effects can never be completely learnt from the mere nature of the means. The effects of gunpowder, that great agent in our military activity, were only learnt by experience, and up to this hour experiments are continually in progress in order to investigate them more fully. That an iron ball, to which powder has given a velocity of 1,000 feet in a second, smashes every living thing which it touches in its course is intelligible in itself. Experience is not required to tell us that. But in producing this effect, how many hundred circumstances are concerned, some of which can only be learnt by experience? And the physical is not the only effect which we have to study, it is the moral which we are in search of, and that can only be ascertained by experience, and there is no other way of learning and appreciating it but by experience. In the Middle Ages, when firearms were first invented, their effect, owing to their rude make, was materially but trifling compared to what it is now, but their effect morally was much greater. One must have witnessed the firmness of one of those masses taught and led by Bonaparte under the heaviest and most unintermittent cannonade in order to understand what troops, hardened by long practice in the field of danger, can do when, by a career of victory, they have reached the noble principle of demanding from themselves their utmost efforts. In pure conception, none would believe it. On the other hand, it is well known that there are troops in the service of the European powers at the present moment who would easily be dispersed by a few cannon shots. But no empirical science, consequently also no theory of the art of war, can always corroborate its truths by historical proof. It would also be, in some measure, difficult to support experience by single facts. If any means is once found efficacious in war, it is repeated. One nation copies another, the thing becomes the fashion, and in this matter it comes into use, supported by experience, and takes its place in theory, which contents itself with appealing to experience in general in order to show its origin, but not as a verification of its truth. But it is quite otherwise if experience is to be used in order to overthrow some means in use, to confirm what is doubtful or introduce something new. Then particular examples from history must be quoted as proofs. Now, if we consider closely the use of historical proofs, 4 points of view readily present themselves for our purpose. First, they may be used merely as an explanation of an idea. In every abstract consideration, it is very easy to be misunderstood, or not to be intelligible at all. When an author is afraid of this, an exemplification from history serves to throw the light which is wanted on his idea and to ensure his being intelligible to his reader. Secondly, it may serve as an application of an idea, because by means of an example there is an opportunity of showing the action of those minor circumstances which cannot all be comprehended and explained in any general expression of an idea, for in that consists indeed the difference between theory and experience. Both these cases belong to examples, properly speaking. The two following belong to historical proofs. Thirdly, a historical fact may be referred to particularly in order only to support what one has advanced. This is in all cases sufficient if we have only to prove the possibility of a fact or effect. Lastly, in the fourth place, from the circumstantial detail of a historical event, and by collecting together several of them, we may deduce some theory, which therefore has its true proof in this testimony itself. For the first of these purposes, all that is generally required is a cursory notice of the case. As it has only been used partially, historical correctness is a secondary consideration. A case invented might also serve the purpose as well, only historical ones are always to be preferred, because they bring the idea, which they illustrate, nearer to practical life. The second use supposes a more circumstantial relation of events, but historical authenticity is again of secondary importance, and in respect to this point, the same is to be said as in the first case. For the third purpose, the mere quotation of an undoubted fact is generally sufficient. If it is asserted that fortified positions may fulfill their object under certain conditions, it is only necessary to mention the position of clausewitz in support of the assertion. But if through the narrative of a case in history an abstract truth is to be demonstrated, then everything in the case bearing on the demonstration must be analysed in the most searching and complete manner. It must, to a certain extent, develop itself carefully before the eyes of the reader. The less effectually this is done, the weaker will be the proof, and the more necessary it will be to supply the demonstrative proof which is wanting in the single case by a number of cases, because we have a right to suppose that the more minute details, which we are unable to give, neutralize each other in their effects in a certain number of cases. If we want to show by example derived from experience that cavalry are better placed behind than in a line with infantry, that it is very hazardous without a decided preponderance of numbers to attempt an enveloping movement with widely separated columns, either on a field of battle or in the theatre of war, that is, either tactically or strategically, then in the first of these cases it would not be sufficient to specify some lost battles in which the cavalry was on the flanks, and some gained in which the cavalry was in the rear of the infantry. And in the latter of these cases, it is not sufficient to refer to the battles of Rivoli and Wagram, to the attack of the Austrians on the theatre of war in Italy in 1796, or of the French upon the German theatre of war in the same year. The way in which these orders of battle or plans of attack essentially contributed to disastrous issues in those particular cases must be shown by closely tracing out circumstances and occurrences. Then it will appear how far such forms or measures are to be condemned, a point which it is very necessary to show, for a total condemnation would be inconsistent with truth. It has already been said that when circumstantial detail of facts is impossible, the demonstrative power which is deficient may, to a certain extent, be supplied by the number of cases quoted. But this is a very dangerous method of getting out of the difficulty, and one which has been much abused. Instead of one well-explained example, 3 or 4 are just touched upon, and thus a show is made of strong evidence. But there are matters where a whole dozen of cases brought forward would prove nothing if, for instance, they are facts of frequent occurrence, and therefore a dozen other cases with an opposite result might just as easily be brought forward. If anyone will instance a dozen lost battles in which the side beaten attacked in separate converging columns, we can instance a dozen that have been gained in which the same order was adopted. It is evident that, in this way, no result is to be obtained. Upon carefully considering these different points, it will be seen how easily examples may be misapplied. An occurrence which, instead of being carefully analysed in all its parts, is superficially noticed, is like an object seen at a great distance, presenting the same appearance on each side, and in which the details of its parts cannot be distinguished. Such examples have, in reality, served to support the most contradictory opinions. To some, Downes' campaigns are models of prudence and skill, to others they are nothing but examples of timidity and want of resolution. Bonaparte's passage across the Noric Alps in 1797 may be made to appear the noblest resolution, but also as an act of sheer temerity. His strategic defeat in 1812 may be represented as the consequence either of an excess or of a deficiency of energy. All these opinions have been broached, and it is easy to see that they might well arise, because each person takes a different view of the connection of events. At the same time, these antagonistic opinions cannot be reconciled with each other, and therefore one of the two must be wrong. Much as we are obliged to the worthy Fuquere for numerous examples introduced in his memoirs, partly because a number of historical incidents have thus been preserved which might otherwise have been lost, and partly because he was one of the first to bring theoretical, that is, abstract ideas, into connection with the practical in war, insofar that the cases brought forward may be regarded as intended to exemplify and confirm what is theoretically asserted, yet, in the opinion of an impartial reader, he will hardly be allowed to have attained the object he proposed to himself, that of proving theoretical principles by historical examples, for although he sometimes relates occurrences with great minuteness, still he falls short, very often, of showing that the deductions drawn necessarily proceed from the inner relations of these events. Another evil which comes from the superficial notice of historical events is that some readers are either wholly ignorant of the events, or cannot call them to remembrance sufficiently to be able to grasp the author's meaning. So there is no alternative between either accepting blindly what is said or remaining unconvinced. It is extremely difficult to put together or unfold historical events before the eyes of a reader in such a way as is necessary, in order to be able to use them as proofs, for the writer very often wants the means and can neither afford the time nor the requisite space, but we maintain that when the object is to establish a new or doubtful opinion, one single example thoroughly analysed is far more instructive than 10 which are superficially treated. The great mischief of these superficial representations is not that the writer puts his story forward as a proof, when it has only a false title, but that he has not made himself properly acquainted with the subject, and that from this sort of slovenly, shallow treatment of history, 100 false views and attempts at the construction of theories arise, which would never have made their appearance if the writer had looked upon it as his duty to deduce from the strict connection of events everything new which he brought to market, and sought to prove from history. When we are convinced of these difficulties in the use of historical examples, and at the same time of the necessity of making use of such examples, then we shall also come to the conclusion that the latest military history is naturally the best field from which to draw them, inasmuch as it alone is sufficiently authentic and detailed. In ancient times, circumstances connected with war, as well as the method of carrying it on, were different. Therefore, its events are of less use to us, either theoretically or practically, in addition to which military history, like every other, naturally loses in the course of time a number of small traits and lineaments originally to be seen, loses in colour and life like a worn-out or darkened picture, so that perhaps at last only the large masses and leading features remain, which thus acquire undue proportions. If we look at the present state of warfare, we should say that wars since that of the Austrian succession are almost the only ones which, at least as far as armament, have still a considerable similarity to the present, and which, notwithstanding the many important changes which have taken place, both great and small, are still capable of affording much instruction. It is quite otherwise with the War of the Spanish Succession, as the use of firearms had not then so far advanced towards perfection, and cavalry still continued the most important arm. The farther we go back, the less useful becomes military history, as it gets so much the more meagre and barren of detail. The most useless of all is that of the Old World. But this uselessness is not altogether absolute. It relates only to those subjects which depend on a knowledge of minute details, or on those things in which the method of conducting war has changed. Although we know very little about the tactics in the battles between the Swiss and the Austrians, the Burgundians and French, still we find in them unmistakable evidence that they were the first in which the superiority of a good infantry over the best cavalry was displayed. A general glance at the time of the condottieri teaches us how the whole method of conducting war is dependent on the instrument used, for at no period have the forces used in war had so much the characteristics of a special instrument, and been a class so totally distinct from the rest of the national community. The memorable way in which the Romans in the Second Punic War attacked the Carthaginian possessions in Spain and Africa, while Hannibal still maintained himself in Italy, is a most instructive subject to study, as the general relations of the states and armies concerned in this indirect act of defence are sufficiently well known. But the more things descend into particulars, and deviate in character from the most general relations, the less we can look for examples and lessons of experience from very remote periods. For we have neither the means of judging properly of corresponding events, nor can we apply them to our completely different method of war. Unfortunately, however, it has always been the fashion with historical writers to talk about ancient times. We shall not say how far vanity and charlatanism may have had a share in this, but in general we fail to discover any honest intention and earnest endeavour to instruct and convince, and we can therefore only look upon such quotations and references as embellishments to fill up gaps and hide defects. It would be an immense service to teach the art of war entirely by historical examples, as Feuquieres proposed to do, but it would be full work for the whole life of a man, if we reflect that he who undertakes it must first qualify himself for the task by a long personal experience in actual war. Whoever, stirred by ambition, undertakes such a task, let him prepare himself for his pious undertaking as for a long pilgrimage. Let him give up his time, spare no sacrifice, fear no temporal rank or power, and rise above all feelings of personal vanity, of false shame, in order, according to the French code, to speak the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. End of Book 2, Chapter 6. Recording by Timothy Ferguson, Gold Coast, Australia.
Our listeners will proceed on Volume 1, Book 3. Thank you for listening. አድማጮቻችን እንግዲህ የሶስተኛውን ፓርት ደግሞ እንቀጥላለን ማለት በሚቀጥለው ዝግጅታችን እናመሰግናለን።